Thank you for joining in today's Cryptid Horror Stories. The first story today is called The Joints of the World, and this is a horror story about the Cipactli. And in this story, a deep-sea mining operation off the coast of Veracruz disturbs a prehistoric shelf. They don't find oil, they wake Cipactli. The creature doesn't just eat the crew, it absorbs the organic matter to fuel its massive growth. The horror begins when the creature reaches the shore, not as a mindless animal, but as a biological vacuum that consumes entire fishing villages in a single night. The second story today is called The Embrace of Huggin Molly, and this is a horror story about Huggin Molly. And in this story, two city-dwelling cousins arrive in Abbeville for a family estate settlement. They notice a bizarre local quirk. At 9 p.m., the town doesn't just go quiet. The doors are bolted with heavy iron bars, and the streetlights are manually shut off by a town councilman. The locals treat Huggin Molly as a quaint cautionary tale for children, but the elders exhibit a genuine, trembling fear of the embrace. In the description below, the stories have been timestamped. Also, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button so you don't miss the stories yet to come. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Joints of the World. The first thing you notice isn't the size of the beast, but the sound of 10,000 teeth clicking in unison, like a million castanets made of bone. The sound comes from everywhere and nowhere, from the ground and the air and the water, and it is not a single sound but a chorus, a symphony of small, percussive impacts that, when combined, when layered one upon another in their tens of thousands, produce a noise that is less heard than felt. A vibration that enters through the soles of the feet and travels up the skeleton like an electric current. A frequency that resonates not in the eardrums but in the marrow, in the deep, cellular core of the body where the blood is made. And the body, hearing it, does what any body does when it hears the language of a predator. It freezes. The Saria was a deep-sea mining vessel registered in Panama, crewed by a mix of Brazilians, Filipinos, and a single Norwegian engineer named Lars who had been working in deep-water extraction for 20 years and who, when the ship's drilling platform began operating at a depth of 3,200 meters in the Veracruz Canyon, told anyone who would listen that the area felt wrong. "It's the sound," he said to Captain Mendes, the ship's master, during the second day of operations. "The water sounds different down there. I've been listening to the acoustic profile of the seabed for 20 years, and I've never heard anything like this. It's not rock, it's not sediment, it's something else. Something that's not supposed to be there." Captain Mendes, who was 3 months from retirement and who did not want any complications on his last contract, told Lars that the acoustic profile was a geological feature, a function of the unusual composition of the canyon floor, and that it would be noted in the post-operation report and reviewed by the geologists at the company's headquarters in Sao Paulo, and that in the meantime, Lars should focus on his job and stop listening to the ocean. Lars went back to his station. He put on his headphones. He listened to the acoustic feed from the remotely operated vehicle that was drilling into the seabed at 3,200 meters, and the sound was there. A rhythmic, organic sound, not the flat, dull thud of drill bit on rock, but a complex, layered, almost musical sound, a pattern of clicks and pops and wet, slithery noises that reminded Lars of something he could not identify, something from childhood, something primal, and the recognition, when it came, made him pull the headphones off his head and stare at the wall for a full minute, because the sound the seabed was making was the sound of chewing. Something down there was chewing. At 3:14 a.m. on the third day of operations, the drill hit something that was not rock. The sensor data from the ROV showed a sudden change in density, a transition from the expected geological strata to something that was softer, warmer, organic, and the drill, which was designed to cut through basalt and sediment, went through this material like a knife through flesh. And the acoustic feed. Lars was listening, Lars was always listening now, erupted with a sound that was not chewing but screaming, a high-frequency, ultrasonic shriek that was beyond the range of human hearing, but that was detected by the sensors, and that was translated, by the software, into a visual waveform that spiked and jagged and danced with a violence that made Lars's stomach drop. Because the waveform was not random, not chaotic, not the sound of breaking rock or collapsing sediment, but structured, patterned, the sound of a living thing in pain. The ROV's cameras showed nothing. At 3,200 meters, the water was black, and the only light was the ROV's own floodlights, which illuminated a cone of murk 10 meters across. But the drill was pulling up something that was not rock, not sediment, not anything that belonged on a geological survey. The material was dark, fibrous, wet, and it was warm. The core samples came up at 28 degrees Celsius, which was impossible, because the water at that depth was 4 degrees, and nothing organic should have been producing heat at 3,200 meters. Lars sent a sample to the lab. The technician, a young Brazilian woman named Camilla, analyzed it and called Lars back within the hour, and her voice was the voice of someone who has encountered something that does not fit into any of the categories she was trained to use. "This is tissue," she said. "Animal tissue, muscle fiber. The cellular structure is unlike anything I've seen. It's not any known species, not any known phylum, not any known kingdom. The cells are enormous, 10 times the size of normal animal cells, and they have something inside them that I can't identify, something that looks like teeth. Microscopic teeth. The entire tissue is lined with them, inside and out." "Teeth," Lars said. "Microscopic teeth. Thousands of them per cell, millions per cubic centimeter. The entire sample, every fiber, every layer is full of them. It's like someone took a file and covered every surface with teeth, inside and out, and then wrapped it in muscle and sent it to the bottom of the ocean." "What do you think it is?" "I don't think, Lars, I know. It's alive. Whatever we drilled into, it's alive and it's big and we heard it, and based on the cellular density and the size of the tissue fibers, I would estimate that the organism we're sitting on top of is not something that lives on the seabed. It is the seabed, or at least a part of it, a very large part." The Saria sent a distress signal at 4:02 a.m. The signal was brief, automated, and it contained no voice communication, no details, no information beyond the vessel's coordinates and the code for emergency, loss of vessel control. The signal was received by the Brazilian Navy's monitoring station in Salvador and was flagged as a mechanical failure, which was common for deep-sea vessels operating in extreme conditions. A rescue vessel was dispatched, with an estimated arrival time of 14 hours. The rescue vessel arrived at the Saria's last known position at 6:00 p.m. that evening. It found nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no life rafts, no emergency beacons, no floating debris. The ocean surface was calm, the water clear, and the depth finder showed the seabed at 3,200 meters, flat and featureless, as though nothing had ever been there. The Saria, a 120-meter mining vessel with a crew of 47, had been consumed without a trace, as though the ocean had opened its mouth and swallowed it whole. What the rescue vessel did not know, what no one would know for several more days, was that the Saria had not been destroyed. It had been eaten. The organism that the drill had penetrated, the thing that Camilla had identified as living tissue, had responded to the injury not with passive defense but with active, aggressive consumption. The ROV's cameras, which continued to transmit for 47 minutes after the distress signal, recorded the event in terrifying detail. The seabed around the drill site began to move, the flat, featureless surface of the canyon floor rippling and buckling as something beneath it stirred. And the ripples spread outward in concentric rings, like the rings on a pond when a stone is dropped, except that the stone was a drill, and the pond was the floor of an ocean, and the ripples were not water but flesh, the skin of a creature so vast that it had been mistaken for geological strata. The creature did not rise. It did not need to. The thing that came up from the seabed was not the whole creature but a part of it, an extension, a pseudopod, a limb of tissue that extruded from the canyon floor and rose through 3,200 meters of water at a speed that defied the physics of displacement, the water not resisting but parting, as though the creature's body was not solid but something between solid and liquid, a gelatinous, tooth-lined mass that flowed upward through the dark water like a nightmare rising through the mind of a sleeper. It reached the area in 12 minutes. The cameras showed the limb attaching to the hull, attaching, not striking, not ramming, but pressing against the steel and then spreading, flowing, covering the surface of the vessel the way a liquid covers a solid. And where the tissue touched the steel dissolved, the hull plating corroding, softening, yielding, not from acid but from the teeth. The millions upon millions of microscopic teeth that lined every surface of the creature's tissue, each one scraping, rasping, filing away the metal atom by atom, and the sound. The sound was the sound Lars had been hearing, the clicking, the castanets, the million tiny percussive impacts of teeth on matter, and the matter in this case was a ship and everything in it. The crew did not drown. Drowning would have been a mercy. The creature consumed them the way it consumed the steel, not by swallowing but by absorbing, the tissue pressing against the dissolving hull and entering the ship, flowing through the corridors and the compartments and the cabins, and the crew, who had been sleeping, who had been eating, who had been working, who had been alive, were touched by the tissue, and where it touched them it stuck, and where it stuck it ate, the teeth rasping through skin and fat and muscle and bone, and the screaming lasted for 45 minutes, and then the cameras went dark and the area was gone. The creature ate the ship and the crew and the ROV and the drill rig and the 4,200 tons of steel and equipment and fuel, and it converted all of it, the organic and the inorganic, the living and the dead, into mass, into itself, into more tissue, more teeth, more joints, more mouths. And then it began to grow. The first fishing village to disappear was Costa Esmeralda, a settlement of 340 people on the coast north of Veracruz. It was a small village, a collection of concrete houses and fishing shacks built on a narrow strip of land between the beach and the mangroves, dependent on the sea for everything: food, income, identity, the rhythm of life. The village was quiet after dark. The boats pulled up on the beach, the nets hung to dry, the streetlights off because the generator was turned off at 10 p.m. to save fuel. At 2:17 a.m. on a Wednesday, something came out of the sea. It was not a wave, it was not a storm surge. It was not a tsunami, although the effect was similar. A wall of something, moving from the ocean toward the shore, a mass that was dark and wet and that made a sound as it moved. A sound that was audible to the sleeping villagers even before the mass reached the shore. A sound that woke them, that pulled them from their beds, that drew them to their windows and their doors. And the sound was the sound of teeth. Of thousands of teeth, clicking and rasping and grinding. The sound of a mouth that was not a mouth but a body that was all mouth, every surface of it lined with teeth, every joint of it capable of opening and closing and biting and chewing. And the sound was the sound of all of those mouths opening and closing at once. And the sound was coming from the sea, and the sea was moving. The creature did not attack the village. It did not need to. It moved through the village the way water moves through a sponge, flowing, spreading, filling every space, every room, every doorway, and the teeth did the rest. The villagers who were caught by the mass did not scream for long. The tissue moved over them, around them, through them, and the teeth rasped and filed and ground, and the bodies were not bitten but absorbed, broken down at the molecular level by the collective action of billions of microscopic mouths. And the process was fast, faster than drowning, faster than burning, but not fast enough, not nearly fast enough, because the creature did not just consume the body. It consumed the consciousness. The nerve endings, the pain receptors, the brain itself, these were dissolved last, so that the person was aware, was feeling, was experiencing for the entire duration of the process, and the process, for a human body, took approximately 4 minutes. 4 minutes of being eaten alive from the outside in, by something that was not an animal but a landscape, a living terrain of teeth and tissue that moved over you the way a glacier moves over a mountain, slow and inevitable and grinding. And the last thing you experienced was the teeth reaching your brain. And the last thing you felt was the teeth entering your brain. And the last thing you thought, whatever it was, whoever it was about, whatever prayer or curse or word or name, was dissolved into the mass along with everything else, and you were gone, and the creature was larger. Costa Esmeralda was gone by 2:34 a.m. 17 minutes. 340 people, their houses, their boats, their nets, their dogs, their chickens, their church, their school, their entire world consumed and converted into mass, and the creature grew, and the creature moved on. It did not stop. It did not rest. It did not slow down. It moved along the coast, village by village, settlement by settlement, and it took them the way a snake takes eggs, one after another, each one making it larger, each one adding to its mass and its complexity and the number of its mouths. By dawn, 3 villages were gone. By noon, 5. By the end of the first day, the creature had consumed a stretch of coastline 40 kilometers long, and the number of its mouths had increased by a factor of 10. And the sound, the clicking, the castanets, the million tiny teeth, was now audible from a kilometer away, and the people who heard it ran, and the people who ran were not always fast enough. The Mexican government responded on the second day. The Navy sent a frigate. The frigate found the creature at 7:00 p.m. at the mouth of the Jamapa River, where it had paused, not to rest but to process, to convert the mass it had consumed into new tissue, new teeth, new joints. The frigate's captain, a man named Commander Ortega, saw the creature through his binoculars and did not believe what he was seeing, because the thing in the water was not an animal. It was a coastline. It was a living, moving, eating coastline, a mass of dark tissue that stretched from one side of the river mouth to the other, that was as tall as the frigate's bridge, and that was covered, not in scales, not in skin, not in any surface that the captain could recognize, but in joints. Hundreds of them, thousands of them. Each joint was a hinge, a flexion point in the creature's armor, and each joint, when it opened, revealed a mouth, a pink, glistening, tooth-lined mouth that opened and closed and clicked and rasped, and the sound of all of them together was the sound that the captain heard through the walls of his bridge, the sound that made his teeth ache and his eyes water and his skin crawl. Commander Ortega ordered the frigate to open fire. The 76mm cannon fired 20 rounds into the creature's mass, and each round detonated inside the tissue, and each detonation blew a hole the size of a car into the mass, and the holes were filled within seconds, the tissue flowing back together, the joints closing and sealing, the mouths rearranging themselves around the wounds, and the creature did not die. It did not even slow down. It turned slowly, with a ponderous geological patience that was more terrifying than any speed, and it moved toward the frigate, and Commander Ortega, who had spent 25 years in the Mexican Navy and who had faced drug smugglers and hurricanes and the occasional shark, gave the only order that made sense. He turned the ship and he ran. The frigate outran the creature. The creature was fast, but it was not as fast as a naval vessel at full steam, and Ortega, his face white, his hands shaking, radioed the nearest naval base and said, "There is something off the coast of Veracruz, and it is eating everything, and we cannot kill it, and it is coming this way." The message was received. The message was believed. The message was forwarded, with the frigate's sensor data and the captain's report, to the Office of the Secretary of National Defense in Mexico City, and within 6 hours, a decision was made that would determine the course of the next 72 hours of Maya's life. Not the Maya from the Amazon, not the Maya from the village, but a different Maya, a Maya who would not survive this particular story, because this story was not about survival. This story was about the encounter between the human world and something that predated it, something that had been sleeping on the floor of an ocean for longer than the human species had existed, and that had been woken by a drill, and that was hungry. The decision was to deploy Task Force Sledgehammer. Task Force Sledgehammer was not a military unit in any conventional sense. It was a ghost, a rumor, a line item in a classified budget that did not appear in any public document, and that was funded through a chain of accounts so convoluted that not even the auditors who traced them could determine their ultimate source. The task force had been created 7 years earlier, after an incident in the Congo that the world's media had reported as a fungal outbreak, and that the governments of 3 countries knew was something else entirely, an encounter with a biological entity that did not fit into any known classification. Something that was not a bacterium or a virus or a fungus or a parasite, but that was alive, that was organized, that was feeding, and that could not be killed by any means available to conventional military forces. The team had 4 members. Each was a specialist in a different aspect of impossible biology, a term that the task force's founder, a retired general named Vasquez, had coined to describe organisms that existed outside the framework of known science. Vasquez had spent his career in unconventional warfare, in the spaces between the official and the unofficial, and he understood that the world was not as neat and tidy as the textbooks suggested, that there were things in it, deep in the jungles and the oceans and the places where humans rarely went, that had been there for a very long time and that were not friendly, and that were not going to stay hidden forever. Captain Victor Thorne was the team's leader. He was 46, a veteran of 20 years of unconventional warfare, special operations, black ops, the kind of missions that did not have names or dates or locations and that were not discussed, even in private, even with family, even with the chaplain. Thorne had been in the Congo 7 years ago, and what he had seen there, a village consumed by something that grew from the ground like a fungus, and that ate people not by biting but by absorbing, by growing into them, by extending its tissue into theirs, had marked him the way a brand marks cattle, permanently, indelibly, in a way that changed not what he thought but what he saw. He saw the world differently now. He saw the seams. He saw the places where the surface of the world, the comfortable, rational, explicable surface that most people took for granted, was thin, was stretched, was barely covering something that was not comfortable or rational or explicable, and he spent his life watching those seams, waiting for them to split, and when they split, he was the one who was sent to stitch them back together. He was tall, lean, and weathered in the way that men who have spent too much time in too many climates are weathered. Not tanned but worn, the skin of his face like old leather, the lines around his eyes cut deep by sun and wind, and the particular, corrosive stress of being afraid for long periods of time. His hair was cropped short, more gray than brown, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who has seen things that would have broken most people, and that had not broken him, but that had instead made him strange. Strange in the way that a survivor of a shipwreck is strange. Still functional, still operational, but operating in a different mode than the people around him, tuned to a frequency that most people could not hear. Dr. Aris Thorne, no relation, a coincidence that the team found amusing and that the 2 Thorns found tiresome, was the team's biologist. She was 38, with the intense, focused demeanor of someone who had spent her career studying organisms that most people did not believe existed. She was a specialist in extremophiles, organisms that lived in extreme environments, in volcanic vents and polar ice and the crushing darkness of deep ocean trenches, and she had been recruited to the task force because the things that the team encountered were, without exception, extremophiles, organisms that lived in conditions that were lethal to most life, and that had developed, over millions or billions of years, adaptations that were not merely unusual, but that violated the assumptions of conventional biology. She was small, compact, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the calloused hands of someone who did her own field work, who touched things, who held things, who got her hands dirty, and her eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses, were the eyes of a scientist, curious and precise, and the curiosity was her strength and her weakness, because it was the thing that made her brilliant and the thing that would, eventually, put her in the mouth of something that she wanted to study more than she wanted to survive. Kalen Voss, known to the team as the Breach, a nickname he had earned in the Congo by being the first person to enter the collapsed mine shaft where the biological entity had been found, and by being the only person to enter it and come back out, was the team's demolitions expert. He was 33, built like a refrigerator, with the broad, blunt, unsubtle physique of a man who viewed his body as a tool and who maintained it with the same care that he maintained his explosives. Precisely, methodically, and with an awareness that the tool, if misused, could kill him. Voss was not a thinker, he was a doer. He was the person who, when the team identified a target, was responsible for turning that target into a crater, and he was very, very good at it. And he was also, beneath the muscle and the bravado and the casual, profanity-laced banter that he used to manage his stress, terrified of the things the team encountered, and the terror was the engine that drove him, because Kalen Voss was a man who responded to fear not by running but by blowing things up, and the bigger the fear, the bigger the explosion. Sarah Seitz Jenkins was the team's scout and marksman. She was 29, the youngest member of the team, with the lean, wiry build of a long-distance runner and the still, patient eyes of a sniper. She had been recruited from the Canadian Special Operations Forces, where she had set records for long-range marksmanship and where she had developed a reputation for two things: her ability to see things that other people missed and her absolute, immovable calm under pressure. Jenkins did not panic. Jenkins did not flinch. Jenkins had been in situations where the world was falling apart around her, firefights, ambushes, the kind of chaos that turns rational people into screaming animals, and she had remained calm, had remained still, had remained functional, and her calm was not courage but something else. Something that she described when asked as a switch, a thing in her mind that she could flip when the noise got too loud, a thing that turned off the fear and the doubt and the confusion and left only the task, only the mission, only the next breath and the next shot and the next step. The team was assembled at the military base in Veracruz on the morning of the third day, 20 hours after the first fishing village had been consumed. They were briefed by a nervous intelligence officer who had been up all night reviewing the sensor data from the frigate and the satellite imagery that showed, with terrible clarity, the extent of the creature's advance. 40 kilometers of coastline gone, 3 villages gone. And the creature still moving, still eating, still growing. A dark, irregular mass that was visible from space and that was, according to the satellite's thermal imaging, generating heat, metabolic heat, the heat of an organism in a state of active, aggressive, exponential growth. "We're calling it Cipactli," the intelligence officer said, pulling up a slide that showed an Aztec codex illustration, a strange, part crocodile, part fish, part toad creature, its body covered in mouths, its joints lined with teeth. After the Aztec myth, Cipactli was a primordial sea monster, a creature of chaos that the god Tezcatlipoca and Quetzalcoatl had to defeat to create the world. The myth says that every joint of its body was a mouth. The myth says that it was so hungry that it ate the gods' own creations, and that they had to sacrifice parts of themselves to satisfy it. The myth says that it was eventually killed and its body used to create the land and the sea. The myth says a lot of things. The point is, whatever this thing is, the Aztecs knew about it. They knew about it 500 years ago and they called it Cipactli, and they were afraid of it. "Are we afraid of it?" Thorne asked, and his voice was flat, unemotional, the voice of a man who is not asking a rhetorical question but a practical one, A question that will determine how he deploys his team and what rules of engagement he establishes. Yes, the intelligence officer said. We are afraid of it. We are very afraid of it. Thorn nodded. Good, let's go. They deployed by helicopter at noon, flying low over the coastline, following the trail of the creature's advance. The trail was unmistakable. Where the creature had passed, the coast was gone. Not destroyed, gone. The beaches, the mangroves, the rock formations, the villages, the roads, the power lines, everything. Consumed, absorbed, converted into the creature's mass. And the coastline that had been there the day before was now a flat, dark, featureless expanse of tissue that stretched from the water's edge to the tree line. A new skin over the earth, living, pulsing, clicking. The sound was the first thing that hit them. Even inside the helicopter, with the doors closed and the engine roaring, they could hear it. The clicking, the castanets, the million tiny teeth. And the sound was louder than it should have been. Louder than the helicopter's engine, louder than the wind. As though the creature was producing the sound not as a byproduct of its feeding, but as a weapon. A sonic assault designed to disorient, to disable, to break the will of anything that approached. Jenkins was the first to see it. She was in the open door of the helicopter, her legs dangling over the void, her eyes, enhanced by a pair of military-grade thermal goggles, scanning the coastline below, and she saw the creature, and she did not speak for a long time, and when she did speak, her voice was the voice of someone who has flipped the switch, who has turned off the fear and left only the task, because the fear, if she let it in, would be too large, too vast, too cosmic to manage. It's there, she said, 2 o'clock. Moving south along the coast. I don't know how to describe it. It's a landscape. It's a moving landscape. It's as wide as a football field, maybe wider, and it's, God, the mouths. I can see the mouths. Hundreds of them. They're opening and closing. They're all opening and closing. Thorn moved to the door and looked. The creature was below them. A dark, irregular mass that was moving through the mangroves at the edge of the coast, and the mangroves were disappearing beneath it. The trees folding, collapsing, being absorbed. The roots and the trunks and the leaves all being taken into the mass and converted. And the mass grew as it moved, the edge of it advancing like a slow. Dark tide, and the clicking was everywhere, the sound rising from the creature in waves. And Thorn, who had seen the thing in the Congo and who had spent 7 years studying impossible biology and preparing for the day when he would encounter something worse, felt the switch in his own mind. The switch that Jenkins had, the switch that Voss did not have and that Dr. Aris did not want, and he flipped it and the fear went out, and the task remained, and the task was simple: kill it or die trying. We track it to the mangroves, Thorn said. We find a place where we can get close, we assess, we engage questions. Yeah, Voss said from the back of the helicopter, where he was checking his charges for the 3rd time, his hands steady, his eyes focused, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. What's the over-under on us getting out of this alive? There is no over-under, Thorn said. There is the mission. We execute the mission. We'll figure out the rest after. That's not an answer, Captain. It's the only answer I have, Kalen. We go in. We do the job. We adapt to what we find. That's what we do. The helicopter carried them inland to a landing zone on a ridge above the mangroves, and they disembarked and they geared up, and they began to move toward the creature, and the clicking grew louder, and the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, and Sarah, Sights, Jenkins, walking point, her thermal goggles down, her rifle up, her breathing slow and steady, stopped at the edge of the mangroves and said very quietly, "It's here." The mangrove swamp was a world of mud and water and roots, a labyrinth of channels and islands and tangled vegetation that was, in its natural state, one of the most impenetrable environments on Earth. The mangroves grew in dense thickets, their roots arching down from the trunks into the water like the legs of enormous spiders, and the water was dark, stained by tannins from the trees, and the mud was deep. The kind of mud that grabs your boots and does not let go. The kind of mud that is more than an obstacle. It is a hazard because in a mangrove swamp in the dark, with something behind you that wants to eat you, mud that holds your feet is a death sentence. The team moved in formation, Jenkins on point, Thorne behind her, Dr. Arris in the middle, Voss at the rear carrying 30 kilograms of demolitions. They moved slowly, carefully, testing each step, the mud sucking at their boots, the roots grabbing at their ankles, the water rising to their knees in the channels and falling to their shins on the islands. And the air was thick with the smell of salt and rot and something else. Something that was not salt and not rot but that was biological, organic, the smell of metabolism, of a body in a state of active, voracious, insatiable processing. The clicking was constant. It was not coming from a single direction but from everywhere, from the ground, from the water, from the roots. And Jenkins, who was tracking the sound with a directional microphone, realized with a chill that the sound was not coming from the creature itself. It was coming from the environment. The mud was clicking, the roots were clicking, the water was clicking. The entire mangrove swamp was producing the sound, and she understood in a flash of terrified insight that the creature was not just in the mangroves. The creature was the mangroves. Or rather, the creature had been through here, had passed through here, and in passing through, it had left behind fragments of itself, pieces of tissue, individual joints, autonomous mouths that had detached from the main mass and that were now embedded in the mud and the roots and the water, a minefield of biological traps, a landscape of mouths, and every step they took was a step into a field of teeth. "Stop," Jenkins said, and her voice was tight, controlled. "Don't move, the ground is." The log moved. It was lying half-submerged in the mud to their left, a fallen mangrove trunk, gray and weathered, covered in barnacles and algae, the kind of dead wood that you see in every swamp and that your brain categorizes as not a threat and moves past. But the log was not a log. The log opened an eye. The eye was not a vertebrate eye. It was not a fish eye or a reptile eye or a mammal eye. It was a compound eye, a cluster of hundreds of small, dark, glistening lenses that were set into the surface of the log, in a pattern that was not random but arranged, designed, positioned to provide 360-degree coverage. And the eye, because it was a single eye, a single organ made of many lenses, was looking at them, and the looking was not passive. It was active. It was hungry. It was the looking of a predator that has identified prey and that is calculating distance and angle and timing. And the log began to change shape, the surface rippling, the barnacles and algae falling away as the tissue beneath them shifted and rearranged, and a joint, a hinge in the creature's armor, opened, and the mouth was there. A mouth that was not a mouth but a cross-section of the log, a cross-section that was lined top and bottom with rows of teeth, and the teeth were not microscopic, not this time. They were the size of fingers, dark, curved, wet, and they were clicking, snapping together with a sound that was not a click but a crack, a wet, organic crack, and the mouth opened wider and wider, and the team moved. "Move," Thorne shouted, and Jenkins was already moving, her legs pumping, her boots tearing free of the mud with a sucking sound that was obscene in its intimacy, and the mouth snapped shut behind her, the teeth crashing together with a force that sent a spray of mud and water into the air, and the log was not a log but a segment. A fragment, a piece of the creature that had been left behind, that had been waiting, and the fragment, now that its ambush had failed, began to move, pulling itself through the mud toward them, and it was not fast. It was slow, ponderous, the movement of something that was designed for ambush, not pursuit, but there were more of them. They were everywhere. The fallen logs, the root masses, the mud banks, the floating mats of vegetation, every surface, every object, every piece of the mangrove swamp that looked natural, that looked like it belonged, that looked like it was part of the landscape, was a potential fragment of Cipactli, a dormant mouth waiting for prey to step close, and the team realized with a horror that was not panic but something deeper, something colder, that they were not in a mangrove swamp. They were in a feeding ground. They were standing inside the creature's mouth, and the mouth was closing. "Jenkins, find us a path," Thorne shouted, and his voice was still flat, still controlled, still the voice of a man who has flipped the switch. But the switch was straining now, the fear pressing against it from the other side, because the situation was not a situation that could be managed with tactics and training and willpower. It was a situation that required luck, and luck was not a military asset. "I'm trying," Jenkins said, and her thermal goggles were down and she was scanning, and the thermal image was a nightmare. The ground was warm, the water was warm, everything was warm because everything was alive, everything was tissue, everything was part of the creature, and the only cold spots were the four humans, their bodies visible in the thermal image as small, bright, heat-producing figures in a landscape of biological warmth. 4 warm spots in a sea of mouths. "Right," Jenkins said. "There's a ridge higher ground 20 meters to the right. The tissue is thinner there. I can see rock. We can get above it." "Go." They went. They went through the mud and the water and the roots, and the fragments came after them. Not just the log, but others. Logs and root masses and mud banks detaching from their positions and moving, pulling themselves through the swamp with the slow, inexorable patience of geological processes. And the mouths were opening and the teeth were clicking, and the sound was the sound of 10,000 teeth. No, 100,000, no, 1,000,000. The sound growing as the fragments activated, as the dormant mouths woke, as the landscape came alive around them. Jenkins was fast. Jenkins was always fast. She hit the ridge first, a low outcrop of limestone that rose above the mud and the water, a piece of the real earth, the real geology that the creature had not yet covered, and she turned and offered her hand to Doctor Aris, who was struggling, the mud gripping her legs, her boots sunk to the ankle, and the fragments were close, were very close. The nearest one, a root mass the size of a dining table, was 3 meters behind her, its mouth open, its teeth clicking, and Jenkins grabbed Dr. Aris's arm and pulled, and Dr. Aris came free, her boots left behind in the mud, and she scrambled up the ridge in her socks, and Voss was behind her, and he was carrying his charges, and a fragment was at his heels. And he turned and kicked it, the kick of a man who views everything as a problem that can be solved with force, and his boot connected with the fragment's mouth, and the mouth closed on his boot, and the teeth went through the leather like it was paper, and Voss screamed, a short, sharp, involuntary sound, and he pulled his foot free. And the boot was gone, consumed, dissolved, and his foot was bleeding, the teeth had gone through the leather and into the flesh, and the blood was dark and fast, and Thorne grabbed him and hauled him up the ridge, and they were on the rock, they were above the mud, they were above the mouths, and the fragments were gathering below them, pooling around the base of the ridge like water around a stone, and the clicking was constant, and the mouths were opening, and the team was trapped. "Status," Thorne said, and his voice was the voice of a captain, the voice of a man who is responsible for 3 other lives and who cannot afford to feel what he is feeling. "Voss is hurt," Jenkins said, wrapping a tourniquet around his foot. "Deep lacerations. He can walk but he can't run." "The charges?" "Intact," Voss said through gritted teeth, the pain making his jaw tight, his face pale. "I can still blow things up. Just tell me what to blow up." "Dr. Aris." Aris was crouched on the ridge, her bare feet on the cold rock, her eyes wide, her mind working, not with fear but with the intense, focused, almost feverish concentration of a scientist who has encountered something that exceeds every model she has, every theory, every framework, and who is responding not with terror but with the overwhelming, compulsive need to understand. "It's not one creature," she said, and her voice was the voice of someone who is having a revelation, and the revelation is terrible, and she does not care, because the understanding is more important than the terror. "It's a colony, a fractal organism. Every fragment is autonomous. Every mouth, every joint, every piece of tissue can function independently, can feed independently, can grow independently. The main mass is not the creature. The main mass is the hub. The fragments are the spokes, and the spokes are everywhere. The entire mangrove swamp is part of it. We're not fighting one creature. We're fighting a landscape. Can we kill it? Thorn asked. Not with guns, not with bombs. It heals too fast. The fragments regenerate. The main mass absorbs damage and converts it into growth. The only way to kill it would be to destroy the central nervous system, the core, the original organism, the hub from which all the fragments are controlled. Where's the core? Aris pointed toward the center of the mangrove swamp, where the thermal image showed a concentration of heat so intense that it was white on the screen, the brightest spot in the landscape, the hottest point, the center of the web. There, the prime mouth, the original organism, everything else is an extension of that. Can we get there? Not through the swamp. The fragments are too dense. We'd be consumed before we got halfway. Then we need another way. Jenkins was looking at the thermal image, her eyes tracing the contours, the heat signatures, the patterns of the creature's body, and she saw something. A gap, a channel, a line of cooler water that ran through the mangroves toward the center, a natural waterway that the creature had not yet covered, a path. There, she said, pointing. A tidal channel, the water's moving. The creature can't anchor in moving water, the tissue washes away. We follow the channel. How wide? Maybe 2 meters, maybe less. Can we fight in a 2-meter channel with a creature that has mouths in every surface? We can try, Jenkins said, and her voice was calm, and the switch was holding, and the fear was on the other side of the switch, and the switch was holding. Or we can stay here and wait for it to figure out how to climb a rock. Thorn looked at the fragments below. They were not just pooling, they were stacking. One fragment was climbing on top of another, the tissue fusing, the mouths merging, the mass growing, reaching upward, and the top of the stack was now level with the ridge and a mouth. A mouth the size of a car door, lined with finger-sized teeth, opened at the edge of the rock, and the teeth clicked, and the mouth smiled, and the smile was the smile of something that has all the time in the world. We go, Thorn said, now. The tidal channel was a wound in the body of the mangrove swamp, a narrow vein of moving water that cut through the tissue of the creature's territory like a river through a desert. The water was dark, stained by tannins, but it was moving. A steady, tidal current that pushed upstream from the coast, and the movement was the key, because the creature's tissue, for all its adaptability, for all its horrifying resilience, could not anchor in moving water. The fragments that touched the current were swept away, the tissue tearing free from the root masses and the mud banks and floating downstream, and where the current was strong, the channel was clean, stone and sand and water, free of the creature's body, a thin, precious line of safety through a landscape of mouths. They entered the channel in single file, Jenkins on point, rifle up, thermal goggles scanning the banks, the water knee-deep and cold, the current pushing against their legs. The banks were alive, not with the creature's tissue, not directly, but with the mangroves themselves, the trees growing from the channel's edge, their roots arching into the water, and every root, every trunk, every branch was a potential fragment, a potential mouth, a potential ambush. Jenkins checked each one with the thermal goggles, looking for the heat signature that would indicate active tissue, live, hungry, waiting. And she marked each one with a gesture, a tap on the shoulder to the person behind her. Left for clear, right for threat, and the right side taps were frequent, the threats everywhere, the channel a gauntlet of dormant mouths that could wake at any moment. The clicking was their metronome. The sound was constant, a background noise that was as omnipresent as their own heartbeats, but it changed. It rose and fell in intensity, in volume, in rhythm, and Jenkins, who had been listening to it for hours, had begun to read it the way a sailor reads the sea, identifying patterns and shifts that indicated changes in the creature's state. A rise in volume meant the fragments were becoming more active. A change in rhythm meant the main mass was nearby. And a new sound, a wet, slithering, organic sound that was different from the clicking, a sound that was like breathing, like the peristaltic movement of a digestive system, meant that the creature was feeding. The volumes increasing, Jenkins said over her shoulder. "We're getting close to the main mass." "How close?" Thorne asked. 500 meters, maybe less." The channel. Holding but narrowing. The channel was narrowing. The banks were pressing in, the mangrove roots reaching further into the water, and the space between the banks was shrinking, from 2 meters to 1.5 to 1, and the water was rising from knee-deep to thigh-deep, the current slowing as the channel constricted. And Jenkins knew, with the cold, certain knowledge of someone who has been in too many tight spaces, that if the channel closed, if the banks touched, the moving water would stop, and the creature's tissue would flow in, and the channel would become not a path but a throat. "Move faster," she said. "We need to get through before the channel closes." They moved faster. Voss was limping, his wounded foot dragging in the water, the tourniquet holding but the blood seeping, the dark red diffusing in the tannin-stained water like smoke in air, and behind him in the water something sensed the blood. A fragment, a small one the size of a fist attached to a submerged root, detached and began to drift, following the blood trail, the mouth opening, the teeth, tiny needle-like, precise, clicking with a sound that was different from the larger fragments, a higher pitch, a faster rhythm, the sound of a small, efficient predator that does not need to be big to be deadly. "Something's following us," Voss said, and his voice was strained, the pain and the adrenaline and the claustrophobia of the narrowing channel pressing on his composure, and Thorne looked back and saw it. The small fragment, drifting in the current, keeping pace with them, the mouth open, the teeth clicking, and he fired his rifle 3 rounds, the shots deafening in the confined space. The water spraying, the fragment hit, the tissue exploding in a spray of dark organic matter that dissolved in the current, and the clicking stopped for a moment and then resumed, and more fragments were detaching, drawn by the blood, drawn by the noise, a trail of small, autonomous mouths following them through the channel like a trail of leeches. "Keep moving," Thorne said. "Don't stop for anything." The channel opened. Not gradually, suddenly, the banks falling away, the mangroves receding, the space expanding from 1 meter to 10 to 20, and they stepped out of the water and onto a mud flat that was not mud but tissue, dark, warm, pulsing tissue that was the main mass, the hub, the body of Cipactli, and they were standing on it, standing on the creature itself. And the clicking was deafening, the sound so loud that it was not a sound but a pressure, a physical force that pressed against their eardrums and their chests and their teeth, and the thermal image on Jenkins's goggles was a solid white, not patches of heat but a continuous, uniform field of biological warmth, the entire visible landscape alive, active, hungry. "Prime mouth," Dr. Aris said, and her voice was barely audible over the clicking, but her hand was pointing and they looked, and they saw it. The prime mouth was at the center of the main mass, a crater in the tissue, a depression that was 50 meters across and 10 meters deep, and at the bottom of the crater was the mouth, the original mouth, the first mouth, the organ from which all other mouths had grown. It was not like the fragment mouths. It was not a simple opening with teeth. It was a complex, layered, rotating structure, concentric rings of teeth, each ring turning in a different direction, the inner rings fast, the outer rings slow, the teeth interlocking and disengaging and reinterlocking with a mechanical precision that was beautiful and terrible, and the teeth were not microscopic. They were the size of a man's arm, and they were dark, and they were wet, and they were clicking, each one a separate percussion instrument in the orchestra of the prime mouth, and the sound was the sound that had woken Lars on the Seria. The sound that had been audible from a kilometer away, the sound that was not 10,000 teeth but 10 million, 100 million, a billion, a number so large that it lost meaning and became noise, and the noise was the creature, and the creature was the noise, and they were standing on it. "Jesus Christ," Voss said, and the words were not a prayer but a statement, a simple, declarative acknowledgement that they had found what they were looking for, and that what they were looking for was beyond anything that any of them had imagined. "There," Dr. Aris said, pointing not at the mouth but at a spot near the mouth, a cluster of tissue that was different from the surrounding mass, darker, denser, more convoluted, a knot of biological matter that pulsed with a rhythm that was different from the clicking, a slower, deeper rhythm, like a heartbeat. "That's the central nervous cluster, the brain, the core. Everything is controlled from there. If we can destroy that, the fragments lose their coordination. They become autonomous individual mouths, not a colony. Individual mouths can be killed. Individual mouths can be outrun. The colony is what makes it unstoppable." "How do we destroy it?" Thorn asked. "Thermite," Voss said, and his voice was flat, professional, the voice of a man who has found his purpose and who is clinging to it the way a drowning man clings to a rope. "Thermite will burn through anything. Organic tissue, bone, stone, steel. I have enough thermite charges to burn a hole through a tank. I put the charges on the cluster, I wire them, I detonate, and that brain is gone." "The cluster is at the bottom of a 50-meter crater lined with teeth," Jenkins said. "How do you get to it?" "I go down." "You go down into the mouth." "I go down into the mouth, I place the charges, I come back up, and we blow the brain. It's simple. It's just a demolition job. The target is unusual, the access is unusual, but the principle is the same. I go to the target, I place the charges, I pull the trigger. I've done it 100 times. You've never done it in the mouth of something that wants to eat you. That's what makes it interesting." Thorn looked at Voss, and Voss looked at Thorn, and the look between them was the look of two men who have been in situations like this before and who know that the plan is bad and the odds are worse and that the mission requires it anyway, and the look was also a farewell, a silent, unspoken, eyes-only farewell that said, "If I don't come back, you know what to do." "We'll cover you," Thorn said. "Jenkins, fire support. Aris, navigation. I'll hold the perimeter at the crater's edge. Voss, you go down, you place the charges, you get out. 10 minutes. If you're not out in 10 minutes, we detonate anyway." "Understood," Voss said, and the word was heavy with the weight of what it meant. The acceptance that if something went wrong, if he was caught, if the mouth closed, his teammates would not wait for him, would not risk the mission for one man, and he understood this, and he accepted it because he was a soldier and this was the deal. Voss began his descent. The crater wall was not vertical but sloped, a 45-degree angle that was covered in tissue, and the tissue was not smooth but textured, ridged, and the ridges were teeth, smaller than the arm-sized teeth of the prime mouth but still teeth, still sharp, still clicking, and Voss slid down the slope on his back, his boots pushing into the tissue, his hands finding holds in the ridges, and the teeth scraped his gloves, his sleeves, his shoulders. And the clicking intensified as he descended, the fragments in the crater wall waking, the mouths opening, and Voss moved faster, sliding, half falling, the tissue giving way beneath him, his body tearing through the surface and into the mass, and the mass closed around him. Not all at once, not a sudden engulfment, but a gradual peristaltic constriction, the tissue pressing against his sides, his legs, his chest, the teeth rasping through his clothing. And he pushed, and he kicked, and he fought, and the charges in his pack, 30 kilograms of thermite, enough to burn through a tank, were dragging him down, pulling him deeper into the mass. And the clicking was all around him, inside him, the sound of teeth on bone, and he screamed. Not a word, not a name, just a sound, a raw animal sound of a man who is being eaten. And the scream was cut off, not by death but by the mass, the tissue pressing over his mouth, his nose, his eyes, and the last thing Voss felt was the thermite charges, still in his pack, still strapped to his body. And the last thing he thought was, "I've set charges before, I've always set charges, the principle is the same, you place the charge, you pull the trigger," and he reached for the detonator, his hand moving through the tissue that was eating him, his fingers closing around the trigger, and he pressed it, and the thermite ignited. The explosion was not an explosion. Thermite does not explode, it burns. It burns at 2,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to vaporize organic tissue, and the 30 kilograms of thermite that Voss had been carrying ignited inside the creature's mass, inside the tissue that was eating him, and the heat was so intense that it created a vacuum, a sphere of incinerated matter that expanded outward from the point of ignition. And the tissue, the teeth, the joints, the mouths, the flesh, was not just burned but annihilated, reduced to ash and gas in a fraction of a second, and the crater, the 50-meter crater that had contained the prime mouth, became a furnace, a roaring, screaming, white-hot furnace that sent a column of flame and smoke 100 meters into the air. But the central nervous cluster was not destroyed. The thermite had detonated in the wrong place, not on the cluster but in the tissue above it, in the mass that had been consuming Voss, and the charges had burned through the surrounding tissue but had not reached the brain, and the brain was intact, and the creature, wounded but not killed, reacted. The scream was not the clicking. The clicking was the baseline, the ambient noise, the sound of the creature's body operating. The scream was something else, a sound that came from the prime mouth, a sound that was produced by the concentric rings of teeth vibrating at a frequency that was not a click but a howl, a deep, resonant, subsonic howl that was felt in the chest and the stomach and the bowels. A sound that bypassed the ears and went directly to the primitive brain, the brain that controls fight or flight. And the sound said run, the sound said pray, the sound said you are small and I am large and I am going to eat you. And the sound was not metaphorical but literal, because the creature was not just screaming. It was calling. The fragments, the hundreds, thousands of autonomous mouths that were scattered across the mangrove swamp, heard the call and they responded, and the response was not a gathering but an advance, a coordinated, swarm-like movement of mouths and teeth and tissue converging on the crater from every direction, and the team was at the crater's edge, and the fragments were coming. Voss is gone, Thorne said, and his voice was flat, and the flatness was the sound of the switch holding, the switch that was the only thing between him and the screaming, running animal terror that was pressing against it from the other side. The charges detonated, but the brain is intact. The creature is calling its fragments. We have minutes. The brain is there, Dr. Aris said, and her voice was shaking, the scientist's composure finally cracking, the revelation giving way to the reality, the understanding giving way to the terror, and she was pointing at the cluster, at the dark, pulsing knot of tissue that was visible through the smoke and the flame, exposed now. The layers of tissue above it burned away by the thermite. The brain naked and vulnerable and right there, 10 meters down within reach if someone could get to it. It's exposed. The thermite burned away the covering tissue. It's right there. Someone just needs to get down there and destroy it. Jenkins, Thorne said, your thermal charges. Jenkins had 2 thermal charges remaining, not thermite, but a military-grade incendiary compound that burned at 1,600 degrees Celsius, enough to destroy organic tissue but not enough to melt steel. 2 charges, each one the size of a paperback book, each one with a 15-second fuse. They were not enough to destroy the brain, but they were enough to damage it, enough to disrupt the coordination, enough to turn the colony back into a collection of individual mouths that could be outrun, outmaneuvered, survived. I'll go, Jenkins said, and her voice was the voice of the switch, the voice of the calm, the voice of someone who has turned off everything that is not the task and who is operating now on a level that is not courage but functionality, not bravery but mechanism, the precision instrument of a trained mind executing a trained response to an untrained situation. No, Thorne said, I'll go, you're the marksman, if the fragments come you hold them off. Aris, you guide us, tell us where to place the charges. I go down, I place the charges, I get out. You can't carry the charges and navigate the crater and place them accurately in the time we have. You need me down there with you, Jenkins said. Aris stays up top, guides us by radio. We both go down. One carries, one places. Thorne looked at her. The fragments were closing. Jenkins could see them on the thermal goggles, A ring of heat signatures converging from all sides, the mouths moving through the mangroves and the mud and the water, and the ring was tightening, and the time was shrinking, and the switch was holding, and the switch was all they had. "Go," Thorn said. They went down. They went down the crater wall, the tissue still burning from the thermite, the surface charred and smoking, the teeth. The small, clicking teeth, dead, burned away by the heat, and the descent was a slide, a controlled fall, their boots skidding on the charred flesh. The smoke filling their lungs, their eyes streaming, and they hit the bottom of the crater, and the prime mouth was there. The concentric rings of teeth still turning, still clicking, the sound deafening, and the brain was there, 10 meters from the mouth. A dark, pulsing, convoluted mass of neural tissue that was the size of a car and that was generating, visible to the naked eye, electrical impulses. Sparks, flashes, lightning bolts of neural activity that arced across the surface of the brain like a thunderstorm contained in a skull. "Jenkins, the charges!" Thorn shouted over the clicking, over the howling, over the sound of the fragments converging above them, and Jenkins handed him the charges, and he moved toward the brain, and the brain saw him. Not eyes, the brain did not have eyes, but it sensed him. It sensed his heat, his movement, his biological presence, and it responded, the tissue around the brain shifting, the mouth, the prime mouth, turning, the concentric rings of teeth rotating faster, the clicking rising to a crescendo, and from the mouth a tongue. Not a tongue but a tentacle, an extension of tissue, 20 meters long, thick as a man's torso, covered in teeth, shot out and struck the crater wall above them. And the impact sent a spray of charred tissue and smoke into the air, and the tentacle swept toward them, and Jenkins fired her rifle, 3 rounds, 4, 5. The bullets hitting the tentacle, punching through the tissue, the holes closing immediately, the regeneration instant, the healing so fast that the wounds were visible for only a fraction of a second before the tissue flowed back together, and the tentacle kept coming. "Place the charges!" Jenkins screamed, and she was firing, not at the tentacle but at the brain, the rounds hitting the neural tissue, the sparks flashing, the brain recoiling, the tentacle hesitating. And in the moment of hesitation, Thorn reached the brain. And he pressed the first charge against the tissue, and he pulled the pin, and the fuse started. 15 seconds, 14, 13. And he pressed the second charge against the brain on the opposite side, and he pulled the pin, and the fuse started. 15, 14, 13, and the tentacle hit him. It hit him in the chest. Not a strike but a press, the tissue flowing over his body, the teeth rasping through his vest, through his shirt, through his skin, and the pain was not pain but heat, the friction of 1,000,000 microscopic teeth on living tissue, and Thorn screamed. A sound that was not a word but a frequency, the frequency of a body being eaten, and he pushed himself free, the tissue tearing. His skin tearing, and the blood was dark and fast, and the charges were on the brain, the fuses burning, 12 seconds, 11, 10, and the tentacle was coming again. And Jenkins grabbed Thorn and hauled him, and they ran, they climbed, they scrambled up the crater wall, the tissue beneath them shifting, the mouths opening, the teeth clicking, and above them, at the crater's edge, Dr. Aris was shouting. Numbers, seconds, a countdown, and the fragments were there, the ring of mouths closing, and Jenkins fired. Into the fragments, into the tissue, the rifle empty, the magazine spent. And she dropped the rifle, and she pulled Thorn, and they reached the top, the edge, the rim of the crater, and Aris grabbed Thorn's arm and pulled him over the edge. And the countdown was at 3, 3, 2, 1. And the charges detonated. The sound was not a boom. The thermal charges did not explode in the conventional sense. They ignited, and the ignition produced a sound that was between a roar and a whisper, a sustained, high-frequency hiss that was the sound of organic tissue being vaporized. And the light was white, blinding, a flash that turned the mangrove swamp into a daylight landscape for 3 seconds. And the heat was a wall, a physical barrier that pushed them back, that drove them to their knees, that made them cover their faces and close their eyes and press themselves against the ground. And the sound and the light and the heat went on, and then they stopped. The silence was the most terrifying sound of all. For the first time in days, the clicking stopped. Not gradually, not fading, but a sudden, total cessation, as though someone had pulled the plug on the entire organism. And the silence was so complete and so unexpected that the team, what was left of it, 3 people, bleeding, burned, traumatized, lay on the ground and listened to the silence and could not believe it. Because the clicking had been the background of their lives for the past 24 hours, the ambient noise of a nightmare, and the absence of it was not relief but void, a vacuum, a negative space that was not peace but the pause between the inhale and the exhale, the moment between the bite and the swallow. "Is it dead?" Aris asked, and her voice was a whisper, a breath, a sound that barely existed. Thorn crawled to the edge of the crater. The crater was destroyed, not the crater itself, which was still a 50-meter depression in the creature's mass, but the contents, the brain, the prime mouth, the concentric rings of teeth, all of it was gone, replaced by a pool of white-hot slag, the remains of the thermal charges, the vaporized tissue, the ash and the smoke and the molten residue of something that had been alive and that was now, for the moment, not. The brain was destroyed. The central nervous cluster was gone, not damaged, not injured, but gone, vaporized, reduced to its constituent atoms by the heat of the thermal charges, and the fragments, the hundreds, thousands of autonomous mouths that had been converging on the crater, were motionless. They were still alive. Jenkins could see the heat on her thermal goggles, the tissue still warm, still metabolically active, but they were not moving. They were not clicking. They were not coordinated. They were individual mouths, uncoordinated, purposeless, and the purposelessness was the thing that made them survivable, because a mouth without a brain is just a mouth, and a mouth can be avoided, a mouth can be outrun, a mouth can be destroyed. But the main mass was not dead. The tissue was alive. The thermal charges had destroyed the brain but not the body, and the body was vast, a landscape of tissue and teeth and joints that stretched from the crater to the coast and beyond. And the body was injured but not killed, and the body was healing, and the healing was visible. The tissue flowing, regenerating, the burned surfaces growing new layers. The destroyed mouths being replaced by new mouths, and the body was not thinking, was not planning, was not coordinating, but it was hungry, and the hunger was not a thought but a force. A biological imperative that operated below the level of consciousness, and the body, without its brain, was still driven by the hunger, and the hunger was still enormous, and the body was still growing. "We need to go," Jenkins said. "Now, the brain is gone, the coordination is gone, but the body is still alive and it's still healing. We need to get out of the mangroves before it regenerates enough to start moving again." Thorn was bleeding. The tentacle had opened wounds across his chest and abdomen, not deep enough to be immediately lethal but deep enough to be serious, the blood soaking through his vest, his hands red, his face white. Jenkins was bruised, battered, her rifle gone, her thermal goggles cracked, her body pushed to the limit of what it could sustain. Aris was barefoot, her feet cut and bleeding from the rock and the charred tissue, her hands shaking, her composure shattered, her scientist's detachment replaced by the raw, unfiltered terror of someone who has been inside the mouth of something that should not exist. They ran. They ran through the mangroves, through the channels, through the mud and the water, and the fragments were motionless around them. Not pursuing, not attacking, just sitting, just waiting, the mouths open, the teeth silent, the bodies dormant, like minds that had been deactivated but not removed. And the team moved through the minefield with the desperate, focused, single-minded determination of people who know that the deactivation is temporary and that the mines will rearm. They reached the ridge. They reached the helicopter. The pilot, who had been waiting, who had been listening to the radio chatter and the sounds of the battle and who had been very close to leaving without them, started the engine as they approached, and they threw themselves into the cabin, and the helicopter rose, and the mangrove swamp fell away below them, and the creature was visible from the air, a dark, irregular, pulsing mass that covered the coastline and the mangroves and the river mouth, a living landscape of tissue and teeth. And at its center, the crater, the wound, the place where the brain had been, was healing, the tissue flowing inward, closing the wound. And Jenkins, looking down through the cracked thermal goggles, saw something that made her grip the edge of her seat. The tissue at the center of the crater was changing. It was not just healing, it was differentiating. New tissue, denser, more convoluted, was growing in the crater, and the new tissue was pulsing, not with the rhythm of a mouth but with the rhythm of a brain. The creature was regrowing its brain. The thermal charges had destroyed the old brain, and the body, driven by the hunger, by the biological imperative that operated below the level of consciousness, was building a new one. "Thorn," Jenkins said, and her voice was the voice of the switch, but the switch was failing. The comm was cracking, and behind the crack the fear was there, vast and cold and absolute. "It's regrowing the brain. We didn't kill it. We just reset it. It's building a new brain. It's starting over." Thorn, his hand pressed against the wound in his chest, his blood on the floor of the helicopter, his face the color of paper, looked down at the creature, at the growing brain, at the healing body, and he said, "How long?" "Hours," Aris said, and her voice was the voice of a scientist who has been asked a question that she does not want to answer but that she must answer because the answer matters, because lives depend on it, because the truth, however terrible, is the only tool they have. Maybe less. The regeneration rate is its exponential. The new brain will be operational within hours, and when it is, the fragments will reactivate, the coordination will resume, and the creature will continue. It will continue eating, continue growing, continue moving, and nothing we have can stop it because the brain is not a single point of failure. It's a function. The creature generates the brain the way a body generates a liver. You can destroy the liver and the body will grow a new one. You can destroy the brain and the creature will grow a new one. The only way to kill it is to destroy the body, and the body is the size of a coastline. The helicopter flew south, toward Veracruz, toward the base, toward the world of military responses and government decisions and the apparatus of civilization that, until 3 days ago, had seemed sufficient to deal with any problem. And Thorn, looking at the creature below, felt the switch finally give way, felt the calm finally break. And the fear came in, and it was as vast and cold and absolute as he had feared, and it was not the fear of death. Thorn had faced death 100 times and had made peace with it, but the fear of something larger, something older, something that did not care about his death or anyone's death, something that existed on a scale that made human life irrelevant. A biological process that was not malicious but mechanical, not evil but hungry, and the hunger was not a choice but a condition, a fundamental property of the organism, and the organism was not going to stop, and the organism was not going to negotiate, and the organism was not going to be destroyed by anything that the human species had. Because the human species had spent its existence building things that were small and the organism was not small, and the gap between the small and the not small was the gap between survival and extinction. And Thorn, for the first time in his career, for the first time in his life, did not have a plan. The limestone gorge was Dr. Aris's idea. It was the only idea any of them had, and it was not a good idea, but it was an idea. And in the absence of a good idea, any idea that has a non-zero probability of success is worth pursuing, because the alternative is to stand on the beach and watch the thing come out of the mangroves and eat you. The gorge was 12 kilometers south of the creature's current position, a narrow limestone canyon that cut through the coastal ridge like a knife wound, its walls vertical, its floor narrow, its ceiling, the overhanging rock that connected the two walls, thick and heavy and full of geological fractures that a demolitions expert could exploit. If there were any demolitions experts left, which there were not, because Voss was gone, consumed by the very thing they were trying to destroy, and the thermite charges that had been his life's work and his death's cause were ash in the bottom of a crater that was, even now, healing over, growing new tissue, building a new brain. but Jenkins had the two remaining thermal charges, the ones she and Thorne had not placed on the brain, because they had only had two, and two had been enough to destroy the brain but not enough to destroy the body, and the body was regenerating, and the body was growing, and the body was hungry. "How much thermite do we have?" Thorne asked, and his voice was strained, the wounds in his chest pulling, the blood seeping through the field dressings that Aris had applied with the shaking hands of a scientist who had never in her career applied a field dressing, and who was now doing it while a helicopter vibrated around her and a monster grew below her. "None," Jenkins said. "Voss had it all, but I have two thermal charges, and I have the shaped charges from the emergency kit, 3 of them, military grade, designed for bunker busting. They won't destroy the creature, but they'll destroy the gorge." "Explain." "The gorge is limestone. Narrow walls, heavy ceiling, lots of natural fractures. If I place the shaped charges on the ceiling on the fracture lines and detonate them while the creature is inside the gorge, the ceiling comes down. Millions of tons of rock. We bury it." "Bury it, not kill it." "The brain is destroyed. The new brain is growing but not yet operational. If we bury the body before the brain comes online, the fragments lose their coordination permanently. The body is trapped under the rock, unable to move, unable to feed, unable to grow. It's not dead, but it's contained. It's neutralized." "How long before the new brain is online?" Aris, who had been monitoring the thermal data from the satellite feed that the base had patched into the helicopter's communication system, looked at her screen. The crater was healing. The new brain tissue was growing, differentiating, the neural tissue expanding at a rate that made her stomach turn. Not because it was fast, but because it was organized, the tissue not just growing but structuring itself, forming layers, forming connections, forming the architecture of a brain, and the architecture was familiar. It was not the random growth of a tumor. It was the structured development of an organ, the same process that occurs in a fetus, the same sequence of neural tube formation and differentiation and synaptogenesis that produces a brain from a sheet of cells, and the process was happening in hours instead of weeks, compressed, accelerated, driven by the creature's impossible metabolism. 4 hours, Aris said, maybe 6. The new brain will be functional within 6 hours. Then we have 6 hours to lure the creature into the gorge, place the charges, and bring the ceiling down. The creature is not a dog, Thorne. You can't lure it with a bone. No, but it's hungry, and we're the only food left on this coast. They landed at the gorge at 3:00 p.m. The sun was high, the light harsh, the limestone walls of the canyon glowing white in the afternoon heat, and the gorge was beautiful. A narrow, cool, shaded canyon with a stream running through it and ferns growing from the cracks in the walls. And the beauty of it was obscene, a violation of the aesthetic principles that the universe should have been following, because beauty should not exist in the same world as the thing in the mangroves, and the fact that it did. The fact that the gorge was beautiful while the creature was growing was a reminder that the universe did not care, that the universe was not moral, that beauty and horror existed side by side not because they were connected, but because they were independent, and the independence was the horror. The indifference was the horror. The gorge did not know about the creature, and the creature did not know about the gorge, and neither of them cared about the humans who were trying to use one to destroy the other. Jenkins went to work on the ceiling. She rappelled up the gorge wall, her body moving with the automatic, practiced efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times, who does not need to think about where to place her hands and feet because her body knows, the body's knowledge deeper and more reliable than the mind's. She found the fracture lines, geological weaknesses in the limestone, places where the rock had been stressed and cracked by millions of years of tectonic pressure, and she placed the shaped charges, 3 of them at the critical points, the points where the ceiling was thinnest, where the fractures were deepest, where the detonation would produce the maximum collapse, and she wired them, and she ran the detonation cable down the wall and across the gorge floor and to the edge, where Thorn was waiting with the trigger. "The charges are set," Jenkins said, coming down the rope, her hands raw, her face streaked with limestone dust and sweat. "But the ceiling won't come down with just the shape charges. I need the thermal charges too. The thermal charges will weaken the main support, the keystone, the central block that holds the ceiling up. I place the thermal charges on the keystone, the shape charges blow the fracture lines, and the whole thing comes down." "Where's the keystone?" "In the center, directly above the gorge floor. I can reach it from the wall, but I'll need to be directly underneath it." "The creature will be directly underneath it too." "Yes." "Then you place the thermal charges while the creature is in the gorge." "Yes." "Jenkins." "I know, Captain." They looked at each other, and the look was the same look that Thorn and Voss had exchanged, silent, unspoken, the farewell that soldiers give each other when the plan requires someone to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Jenkins shook her head, a small, definitive movement. "I can do it and get out," she said. "The brain is offline. The fragments are uncoordinated. The main mass is moving on instinct, hunger, not strategy. It'll move toward the gorge because we're here and it smells us, but it'll move slowly, clumsily, without the coordination that makes it dangerous. I place the charges, I rappel down, I run. We blow the ceiling. The creature is buried. We walk away." Thorn wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the plan was sound, that the timing would work, that the creature would be slow and clumsy, and that Jenkins would be fast and precise, and that the gorge would collapse and the creature would be buried and they would walk away. They would survive. They would go home, and the nightmares would come later, in the safety of a world that had walls and roofs and the comfortable, rational illusion of control. He wanted to believe this, but he had been in the Congo, and he had seen the thing in the mine, and he knew that impossible biology did not follow impossible plans, that the gap between the plan and the execution was the gap where people died, and that the gap was always wider than you expected. "We do it," he said. "We do it now." They lured the creature. It was simple, brutal, and effective. They waited at the entrance to the gorge, the three of them, Thorn, Jenkins, Aris, and they bled, not metaphorically. Thorn opened the dressings on his chest wounds, letting the blood flow, and Aris cut her palm, and Jenkins, who had no open wounds, pricked her finger with a field scalpel, and the blood, Thorn's blood, Aris's blood, Jenkins's blood, dripped onto the rocks at the entrance to the gorge. And the blood was the lure, the bait, the signal that said food is here. Food is close, come and eat, and the creature, a kilometer away, its brain not yet operational, its body moving on the primitive, subcognitive imperative of hunger, smelled the blood. It moved. The main mass, the living landscape of tissue and teeth and joints, began to move toward the gorge, and the movement was not the coordinated, strategic advance of the first encounter. It was slow, halting, the body moving like a machine that has been turned off and restarted, the joints opening and closing without rhythm, the mouths clicking without coordination, the fragments bumping into each other, colliding, merging, separating, the whole mass lurching forward like a drunk, like a body without a brain, which is what it was, and the sight of it, the vast, dark, irregular lurching, clicking mass moving through the mangroves toward the gorge, was simultaneously the most terrifying and the most pathetic thing any of them had ever seen. The predator reduced to a reflex, the monster reduced to a mouth, and Jenkins, watching it through her cracked thermal goggles, felt something that was not pity but was adjacent to pity, a recognition that the creature, for all its horror, was not evil. It was hungry, and hunger on this scale was not a vice but a condition, a state of being that the creature had not chosen and could not change, and the tragedy of it, the cosmic scale of the universe tragedy, was that the creature's hunger and the human survival were incompatible, and one of them had to lose, and the humans were the ones with the shaped charges. "It's coming," Jenkins said. "It'll be at the gorge entrance in 20 minutes, maybe less. Thermal charges on the keystone, Thorn said. Go. Jenkins went up. She rappelled to the center of the gorge, to the point directly below the keystone, and she placed the 2 thermal charges against the limestone, pressing them into a natural depression in the rock, and she wired them into the same circuit as the shaped charges. 1 trigger, 1 detonation, 1 collapse, and the work was precise, methodical, the work of a professional executing a plan, and her hands were steady, and her breathing was even, and the switch was holding. Below her, the creature entered the gorge. It came in like a tide, the dark tissue flowing through the entrance and filling the gorge floor, the mass squeezing through the narrow canyon, the walls pressing against it, the tissue bulging and compressing and reforming as it pushed deeper into the canyon, and the clicking was back. Not coordinated, not rhythmic, but present, the autonomous mouths clicking independently, each one on its own frequency, the combined sound a cacophony. A chaos of percussion that filled the gorge and echoed off the walls and pressed against Jenkins's eardrums and her chest and her teeth. And the creature was below her, 15 meters below her, and the mouths were opening, and the teeth were snapping, and the mass was flowing. Filling the gorge, reaching for the food that it could smell but not see, the blood on the rocks at the entrance calling it in, drawing it deeper, and the creature was in the gorge. It was in the trap, and Jenkins finished wiring the charges and began to rappel down. She was fast, she was trained, she was the calm, but the creature, even without its brain, was a landscape, and landscapes do not need brains to be dangerous. The tissue below her shifted, a joint, a hinge in the creature's armor, opening, a mouth the size of a dining table yawning open directly beneath her. And the mouth was not clicking but breathing, a warm, wet, organic exhalation that rose from the creature's body like steam from a geyser. And the breath hit Jenkins, and the breath was the smell of the creature's interior, the smell of digested matter, of processed organic material, of the things it had eaten, the villages, the people, the Saria, Voss. And the smell was so thick and so wrong that Jenkins gagged, and her hand slipped and she fell. She fell 3 meters. She hit the creature's body, and the body was not solid. It was soft, yielding, the tissue giving way beneath her like a mattress made of flesh. And she sank into it, the tissue pressing against her back, her legs, her arms, and the teeth, the microscopic teeth, the rasping, filing teeth, began to work, and she felt them through her clothing, through her skin, the friction of a billion tiny mouths, and the pain was not sharp but dull, not cutting but grinding, the sensation of being sanded, of being filed, of being eroded, and Jenkins screamed. A sound that was not the calm, not the switch, but the raw, unfiltered animal scream of a body that is being eaten. And she pushed, she fought, she tore herself free of the tissue, and the tissue tore, and the mouths opened, and the bigger teeth, the finger-sized teeth, the ones that could cut, that could bite, snapped at her, and one of them caught her leg, and the tooth went through her calf, and the blood was instant, hot, red. And Jenkins grabbed the rope. She was still on the rope. She had never let go of the rope. The rope was her lifeline, and she held it with the desperate, white-knuckled death grip of someone who knows that the rope is the only thing between her and the mouth. And she hauled herself up, hand over hand, the blood running down her leg and dripping onto the creature below, and the creature's mouths opened wider, and the teeth snapped faster, and the clicking rose to a crescendo, and Jenkins reached the wall. And she found a hold, and she pulled herself onto the ledge, and she was out, she was free, she was above the creature. And the charges were set, and the trigger was at the edge of the gorge, and Thorn was there, and Aris was there, and the creature was inside the gorge, filling it, the tissue flowing through the canyon like a river of flesh, and the keystone was above it, and the charges were on the keystone, and the shaped charges were on the fracture lines, and everything was ready. "Blow it," Jenkins said, and her voice was wrecked, the calm gone, the switch broken, and what was left was the raw, bleeding, terrified human being beneath the soldier, the woman who had been eaten and had pulled herself free, and who was now lying on a limestone ledge with a hole in her leg and blood on her face and the sound of a million teeth in her ears. "Blow it now, Thorn. Blow it now." Thorn looked at the trigger. He looked at the gorge. He looked at the creature, the vast, dark, pulsing, clicking mass that filled the canyon from wall to wall, that stretched from the entrance to the point directly below the keystone, that was still flowing in, still pushing deeper, driven by the hunger, by the smell of Jenkins's blood. And the creature was in the gorge. The trap was set, the charges were wired, and all he had to do was press the trigger. But Jenkins was not out. Jenkins was on the ledge, on the wall, inside the gorge, and the collapse would bury the gorge, all of it, the floor and the walls and the ceiling, millions of tons of rock falling in a single, catastrophic geological event, and Jenkins was inside. "Get out," Thorne said. "Jenkins, get out of the gorge. I can't blow it with you inside." "I can't move," Jenkins said, and the words cost her something, the admission of helplessness. The surrender of the one thing that she had always had, the calm, the switch, the ability to function under any conditions, and the switch was broken now. The calm was gone, and what was left was a woman with a hole in her leg who could not walk, and who was lying on a ledge inside a gorge that was about to be buried. "Thorne," Aris said, and her voice was the voice of a scientist, not the voice of a soldier, and the scientist was doing what scientists do, which is calculating, which is weighing, which is measuring the cost against the benefit, and the calculation was simple and terrible. One life against the lives that the creature would take if it was not stopped. One person against the coastline, against the city, against the country, and the calculation was not fair. Was not right, was not the kind of calculation that anyone should ever have to make, but it was the calculation that the situation required, and Aris, who had spent her career studying organisms that most people did not believe existed, who had entered the gorge knowing that she might not leave, who had watched Voss die and had placed charges on a brain and had run through a landscape of mouths. Aris made the calculation, and the calculation said, "Blow the gorge." "Thorne," Aris said again, and the word was not a command but a plea for someone else to make the decision, because the decision was too large for one person, the weight of it too heavy for one set of shoulders, but someone had to carry it, someone had to press the trigger, someone had to be the one who traded Jenkins's life for the lives of everyone else. And that someone was the captain, because that was what captains did, that was the deal, that was the weight of the rank. And Thorne, who had been carrying that weight for 20 years, who had made decisions like this before in the Congo and in places that did not have names, looked at the trigger and looked at Jenkins and looked at the creature and pressed the trigger. The shaped charges detonated first. 3 simultaneous detonations placed on the fracture lines and the fractures, geological weaknesses that had been forming for millions of years, cracks in the limestone that had been slowly, patiently, invisibly widening with each tectonic shift, each freeze-thaw cycle, each rainy season opened. The limestone cracked along the fracture lines, the cracks propagating at the speed of sound through the rock, and the ceiling, the heavy, thick, overhanging ceiling of the gorge, began to move. The thermal charges detonated a fraction of a second later. The 2 charges on the keystone ignited, and the thermite burned, and the keystone, the central block, the stone that held the ceiling up, the single piece of rock that was the structural linchpin of the entire gorge, was consumed. The thermite burned through the limestone in seconds, the rock glowing red, then white, then vaporizing, and the keystone was gone, and the ceiling, which had been held up by the keystone for 10 million years, fell. The sound was not an explosion, it was a collapse, a geological event. The sound of millions of tons of limestone falling, the blocks separating, the slabs breaking, the entire ceiling of the gorge coming down in a single, coordinated, catastrophic failure. And the sound was a roar that was beyond hearing, a roar that was felt in the ground and the air and the chest. A roar that was the earth itself speaking, the planet opening its mouth and closing it, and the gorge was filled, not with air, not with light, but with rock, millions of tons of rock falling, crashing, shattering, and the creature was beneath it. The creature screamed. The sound was the subsonic howl, the sound of the prime mouth, but it was not coordinated, was not controlled, was not the calculated scream of a predator calling its fragments. It was the scream of a body being crushed, of tissue being flattened, of mouths being closed by force. And the scream rose through the falling rock and the dust and the smoke. And it was the last sound the creature made. And then the rock hit the floor of the gorge and the scream was cut off. And the silence that followed was the silence of burial, of entombment, of a thing that was not dead but was no longer free, no longer moving, no longer eating, no longer growing. The gorge was gone. In its place was a pile of rubble, a mountain of broken limestone, white and gray and dust-covered, and the rubble was still, was silent, was motionless, and the clicking that had been the background of their lives for 3 days, was gone. Thorn and Eris crawled out of the rubble. They crawled on their hands and knees, the dust filling their lungs, the rock sharp beneath their palms, and they crawled over the edge of the collapsed gorge and onto the hillside above. And they lay there, on the grass, in the sun, in the clean air, and they breathed. And the breathing was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever experienced. The simple, automatic, unthinking act of drawing air into the lungs and releasing it. And the air did not smell of vinegar or blood or digested flesh. It smelled of grass and salt and the sea, and they breathed, and they did not move, and they did not speak. Jenkins was gone. Thorn knew this the way he knew his own name, the way he knew the weight of the trigger in his hand, the way he knew the sound of the collapse and the silence that followed. Jenkins was inside the gorge when the ceiling came down, and the ceiling brought millions of tons of rock, and Jenkins was under the rock, and the rock was on top of the creature, and Jenkins was on top of the creature, or the creature was on top of Jenkins. Or they were mixed together, the human and the monster, the prey and the predator, buried in the same grave, and the grave was a mountain of limestone, and the mountain was permanent, and the burial was permanent, and the silence was permanent, and it was over. The helicopter came 2 hours later, a military retrieval chopper dispatched from the base in Veracruz, and it found them on the hillside, Thorn and Eris, the 2 survivors of Task Force Sledgehammer, bleeding, broken, covered in dust and blood, and the residue of something that was not dust and not blood, but that was biological, organic, the cellular debris of a creature that had been a coastline, and that was now a mountain of rock. They were loaded onto the helicopter. They were given water, blankets, morphine. The morphine was for Thorn, whose chest wounds had reopened during the crawl, and who was losing blood at a rate that the field dressings could not contain. Eris was given water and nothing else, because Eris was not physically injured. Her feet were cut, her hands were raw, but her body was intact, and the damage that she had sustained was not to her body but to her mind, and the damage to her mind was not the kind of damage that morphine could touch. The helicopter rose. It rose above the hillside, above the gorge, above the rubble, the mountain of broken limestone that had once been a canyon and was now a grave, and it turned south, toward Veracruz, toward the base, toward the hospital, toward the world that was waiting for a report, for an explanation, for a narrative that would make sense of what had happened, and the narrative would not make sense. Because the narrative was not a narrative that the world could absorb, because the world, the rational, civilized, 21st century world, did not have a category for what Cipactli was, and the absence of a category was the thing that made it most dangerous, because the things that you cannot categorize are the things that you cannot prepare for, and the things that you cannot prepare for are the things that kill you. Eris looked down. The helicopter was high now, high enough to see the coastline, the mangroves, the stretch of beach where the fishing villages had been, the dark, featureless expanse of tissue that was the creature's body, spread across the coast, and the rubble of the gorge, the white mountain of limestone that buried the creature's center, its prime mouth, its growing brain, and the body was still, was motionless, was not clicking, was not moving, was not growing, and the stillness was the silence. And the silence was the victory, and the victory was a mountain of rubble on a coastline in Mexico, and the cost was 4 people, Voss consumed, Jenkins buried, Thorn dying, Eris shattered, and the cost was too high, and the cost was not enough, and the cost was never enough, because the things that you fight in the deep, in the dark, in the places where humans do not belong, do not care about cost, do not negotiate, do not accept terms, do not stop. The helicopter flew south. The coastline fell away behind them. The rubble mountain shrank to a white dot on the green and brown landscape, and then to a speck, and then to nothing, and Aris watched it go, and she did not look away. She did not close her eyes. She watched the speck until it was gone, and then she closed her eyes. And she saw it still, the white dot, the mountain, the grave, and she knew that she would see it for the rest of her life, that the image was burned into her memory, the way the thermal charges had burned into the keystone, permanent, indelible, a scar on the brain that could not be removed. The retrieval chopper carrying Thorn and Aris banked south and accelerated, and the coastline shrank to a line, and the line shrank to a nothing, and the nothing was the sea, and the sea was calm, and the calm was a lie, because beneath the calm, beneath the waves, beneath the floor of the ocean, in the canyon where the Saria had drilled, something was stirring. Not the creature. The creature was buried, its brain destroyed, its body trapped under millions of tons of limestone, its fragments dormant, its mouth silent. The creature, for now, was contained. But the creature was not one. The creature was a colony, and the colony was a species, and the species had been on the floor of the ocean for longer than the human species had existed, and the Saria had drilled into one, and one had woken, and one had eaten, and one had grown, and one had been buried. But the drilling had disturbed the shelf, and the shelf was a reef, and the reef was a graveyard, and the graveyard was full. In the rubble of the gorge, in the silence of the burial, a sound, not the clicking, that was gone, that was silence, that was buried under the rock. A different sound, a smaller sound. A single, wet, organic sound, the sound of something small, something the size of a fist, something that had broken off from the main mass during the collapse and that had survived the burial, that had been thrown clear of the rubble, that had landed in the stream at the edge of the gorge. And that was now in the silence, in the absence of the brain, in the absence of the coordination, moving. Not clicking, not hunting, not feeding, moving, crawling. The small, toothy joint, a fragment, a parasitic piece of the monster, small enough to go unnoticed, small enough to escape the burial, small enough to fit in a pocket, dragged itself through the stream and over the rocks and toward the coast, toward the water, toward the sea, and the sea was the way back to the reef, and the reef was the way to the others, and the others were sleeping, and the fragment, this small, surviving, hungry piece of Cipactli, was going to wake them. A single wet click. Then another. Then another. The silence of the teeth was over. The hunger, that ancient, patient, cosmic hunger that had been sleeping on the floor of the ocean for longer than the human species had existed, was waking up, and it was starting small, one fragment, one mouth, one click. But the fragment was moving, and the fragment was growing, and the fragment was hungry, and the sea was vast, and the coast was long, and the world was full of food. And the teeth were clicking. The Embrace of Huggin Molly. The coroner's name was Dr. Adelaide Moffat, and she had been the chief medical examiner for Abbeville Parish for 19 years, and in those 19 years she had seen deaths that would have broken a lesser person, the industrial accidents at the paper mill, the drownings in the tea cheffunct, the slow, methodical suicides of the rural poor, the sudden, violent ones of the young, the ones that were, for reasons she had never been able to articulate to her own satisfaction, the worst, because the young were supposed to have time, and time was supposed to be the thing that saved you from the worst of yourself. She had never seen anything like the body on her table. The body belonged to a man named Jefferson Brough, 57 years old, lifelong resident of Abbeville, retired postal worker, and according to the intake report filed by the sheriff's deputy who had found him, deceased under unknown circumstances. No visible signs of external trauma. The deputy had found Jefferson on the sidewalk in front of the Abbeville hardware store at 5:30 a.m., lying on his back, arms at his sides, eyes open as though he had been walking to work, decided to lie down and simply stopped. Dr. Moffat began the external examination at 7:00 a.m. The body was intact. No lacerations, no abrasions, no contusions, no gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no signs of blunt force trauma. The skin was unbroken. The clothing, a flannel shirt, denim jeans, work boots, was clean and undamaged. The only external anomaly was the face. Jefferson Broa's expression was not one of pain or fear or surprise. It was one of longing. This was not a clinical term. Dr. Moffat knew that. She had been trained to describe facial expressions in terms of muscle engagement, the corrugator supercilii, the zygomaticus major, the orbicularis oculi, and she could describe the muscles of Jefferson Broa's face with precision. The orbicularis oculi were contracted, pulling the skin around the eyes into the slight, crinkled configuration that the face adopts when it is looking at something it wants. The zygomaticus major was engaged, but only partially, not the full contraction of a smile but the slight, asymmetric lift of the corner of the mouth that is the face's earliest, most involuntary response to the sight of something desired. The corrugator supercilii, the muscle that pulls the eyebrows together and down, the muscle of worry, of concentration, of longing, was fully contracted, pulling the brows into a knot over the bridge of the nose. The face was not screaming. The face was reaching. Every muscle was oriented toward something that was not there, something that had been there, something that Jefferson Broa had seen in his final moment and had wanted. And the wanting was so powerful, so total, so consuming that it had frozen on his face like a photograph, like a death mask, like the last frame of a film that had stopped playing. Dr. Moffat opened the chest. The ribcage was collapsed. Not fractured, collapsed. The ribs were intact, unbroken, but they had been driven inward, toward the spine, as though a tremendous, evenly distributed pressure had been applied to the outer surface of the chest, front and sides, simultaneously, compressing the thoracic cage into a shape that was not the shape of a human rib cage, but the shape of a crushed cylinder. The ribs bowed inward like the staves of a barrel squeezed by a hoop. The sternum was depressed approximately 4 inches from its normal position. The intercostal spaces, the gaps between the ribs, were closed, the ribs touching, the cartilage that normally allowed the rib cage to expand and contract compressed into a dense, rigid mass. The lungs were destroyed. They had been compressed so thoroughly that the tissue had ruptured, not in one place but throughout, the alveolar walls bursting like bubble wrap under a boot, the lung tissue reduced to a mass of fragmented, blood-soaked sponge. The heart was intact but displaced, pushed downward and to the left by the pressure of the collapsed rib cage, and it was beating, or rather, it had been beating at the time of death, the final contractions of a heart that was trying to pump blood into lungs that could no longer oxygenate it. The eardrums were burst, outward, not inward. The rupture was not the result of a blow to the head or an explosion. The tympanic membranes had been blown outward, the concave surfaces of the eardrums pushed through the ear canals and, in the left ear, partially expelled from the external auditory meatus. The pattern was consistent with a sudden, extreme pressure differential inside the skull, a pressure wave that had originated inside the head and traveled outward through the ears, as though something had screamed into Jefferson Broa's ear with a volume and a frequency that the human auditory system was not designed to withstand. Dr. Moffat leaned close. She examined the ear canals with an otoscope. The tissue was scorched, not burned, not cauterized, but scorched, the cells damaged by a force that was not thermal but mechanical, the acoustic equivalent of a burn, the cellular destruction that occurs when sound waves of sufficient intensity rupture cell membranes. The damage extended down the ear canal and into the middle ear, where the ossicles, the tiny bones that transmit sound from the eardrum to the inner ear, were dislocated. The stapes pulled free from the oval window of the cochlea, as though the vibration that had passed through them had been so powerful that it had torn the bones from their sockets. And in the inner ear, in the cochlea, in the spiral of bone and fluid that turned sound into nerve impulses, Dr. Moffat found something that she would later describe, in her report, as anomalous residue, composition unknown, reddish-brown, viscous, warm to the touch. Warm. The residue was warm. In a body that had been dead for at least 2 hours, in a room maintained at 68 degrees, in a tissue that should have been cooling toward ambient temperature at the predictable rate of 1.5 degrees per hour, the residue in Jefferson Broa's cochlea was warm. Body temperature warm. 98.6 degrees warm. As though something that was alive had been there recently, and had left behind a trace of its own warmth. Dr. Moffat sealed the residue in a specimen container. She labeled it. She placed it in the refrigerator. She went back to the body. She examined the chest more closely. The compression was not, she realized, uniform. It was concentric. The pressure had been greatest at the center of the chest and decreased toward the sides, creating a gradient that was, in cross-section, circular. A ring of force applied to the front of the ribcage, as though something had wrapped around Jefferson Broa's chest and squeezed. As though something had hugged him. Dr. Moffat set down her instruments. She pulled off her gloves. She walked to her office. She sat at her desk. She looked at the wall, where a framed photograph of her daughter hung next to her medical degree, and she thought about the stories her grandmother had told her, the stories about the woman in black, the stories about the embrace, the stories that she had dismissed as a woman of science, as the folklore of a rural community that had always preferred superstition to explanation. She thought about the stories, and she thought about the crushed ribcage, and she thought about the burst eardrums, and she thought about the warm residue, and she thought about the expression on Jefferson Broa's face, the longing, the reaching, the wanting, and she picked up the phone and called the sheriff. "Sheriff," she said, "I need to talk to you about Jefferson Broa, and I need to talk to you about the stories." The stories were old. They went back to the founding of Abbeville, to the 1840s, when the town was a settlement of cotton farmers and cattlemen clustered around a crossroads in the Louisiana Low Country. The stories were about a woman named Molly. No one remembered her last name, or if they did not speak it, who had lived in the settlement and who had been, by all accounts, a person of particular isolation and particular sadness. The details varied with the telling, as details do in oral traditions, but the core was consistent. Molly had been a large woman, tall, broad-shouldered, strong. She had been a seamstress, or a laundress, or a cook, some trade that kept her at the edges of the community, present but not integrated, useful but not included. She had been involved, somehow, with one of the founding families, the Broa family, or the Guidry family, or the Landry family, depending on who was telling the story, and the involvement had ended badly. Betrayal was the word most often used. Molly had been betrayed by the family she had trusted, cast out, silenced, and the silencing had been so complete, so thorough, so effective that the details of the betrayal had been erased from the town's history, the way a stain is erased from a garment, scrubbed, faded, gone. And then Molly had died. Or she had not died, or she had died and come back, or she had never died but had simply gone away, into the woods, into the dark, into the space between the trees where the moonlight did not reach, and had become something else, something that was not a woman but that wore a woman's shape, something that was not alive but that moved, something that was not a ghost but that was not physical, something that walked the streets of Abbeville at night and embraced the people she found there. The embrace. That was the word the stories used. Not attack, not kill, embrace. Molly did not assault her victims, she hugged them. She wrapped her long, strong arms around them and she held them. And the holding was the killing. The pressure, the squeeze, the slow, crushing compression of a body that was being held by something that did not know its own strength, or that knew its strength and did not care, or that had been holding things for so long, holding grief. holding silence, holding the weight of a betrayal that no one remembered, that the holding had become an end in itself, an act of possession, of consumption, of a loneliness so vast and so old that it could only be expressed through the total, physical, bone-crushing embrace of another body. And the scream. The stories all mention the scream. When Molly embraced, she screamed. Not a scream of rage or pain or madness, a scream of something else, something that the stories could not name and that the tellers could only approximate with the phrase, a sound like the end of everything. The scream was the sound that killed, the stories said. The scream was what burst the eardrums and liquefied the organs and stopped the heart. The embrace held you. The scream killed you. The children of Abbeville grew up with the stories. They were told at bedtime, on porches, in the long, slow hours of a Louisiana summer evening when the light was thick and the air was still, and the Spanish moss hung from the oaks like the tattered curtains of a room that had not been cleaned in a century. The children were told that Molly walked at night, that she wore a long black dress and a wide-brimmed black hat that hid her face, that she was tall, taller than any man, taller than any woman, 8 feet tall, some said, and that she walked with a slow, steady, gliding gait that never varied, never accelerated, never slowed, and that if you were out after dark and you heard the sound of heavy fabric dragging on the ground, you should run. But the stories always ended the same way. You could run, but you couldn't escape, because Molly didn't chase. Molly didn't need to chase. Molly walked, and no matter how fast you ran, when you looked back, she was the same distance away, 50 feet, 20 feet, 10 feet, always the same, always steady, always walking, always there. The adults of Abbeville did not tell the stories to scare their children. The adults told the stories to warn them. The adults believed. They did not say they believed. They were modern people, people with smartphones and satellite dishes and jobs that required them to interact with the 21st century. But they believed. They believed in the way that people believe in things they have never seen, but that they know, in the place below language and above instinct, are real. They believed, and they locked their doors at 9:00 p.m. Tomas Broussard did not believe. He arrived in Abbeville on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, driving a rented Hyundai Elantra with Louisiana plates that he had picked up at the Lafayette Airport. He was 34 years old, a data scientist for a fintech company in Austin, Texas, and he was in Abbeville for one reason. His grandmother, Estelle Broussard, had died 3 months earlier and left a property, a house, 2 acres of land, and a collection of personal effects that the estate attorney had described, with the understatement that was the professional register of estate attorneys, as substantial. Tomas had not been to Abbeville since he was 12. He remembered the place in the fragmentary, impressionistic way that children remember places they visited once briefly and did not understand. Oak trees, heat, the smell of crawfish boiling, his grandmother's hands, large, dark, strong kneading dough on a floury counter. He did not remember the stories. If he had heard them, they had not made an impression. He had been a child who was more interested in the book he had brought than in the stories his grandmother's neighbors told on the porch, and the book had been about dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs had been more compelling than any local legend. His cousin Sarah was meeting him there. Sarah Guidry. Her father had been Estelle's nephew, which made Sarah and Tomas second cousins, or first cousins once removed, or something that the family had never been able to agree on, and that did not in practice matter, was a 36-year-old historian who taught at Chilean and who had, unlike Tomas, maintained a relationship with Estelle and with Abbeville throughout her adult life. She knew the town. She knew the people. She knew the stories. Tomas parked the Hyundai in front of Estelle's house, a raised Cajun cottage on a quiet street lined with live oaks, its gallery sagging slightly, its shutters faded, its yard overgrown with the aggressive, tropical verdancy of a Louisiana property that had been untended for 3 months. He got out of the car. The heat hit him like a physical thing, 92 degrees, 90% humidity, the air so thick with moisture that it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. He wiped his forehead. He looked at the house. He thought briefly that he should have come in October. Sarah was already on the gallery, sitting in a rocking chair that had belonged to Estelle, a glass of iced tea in her hand, a battered leather satchel on the floor beside her. She stood when she saw him. She was tall, 5'11", with dark hair pulled back in a braid, and the kind of face that people described as handsome rather than pretty, with strong features and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked like what she was, an academic who spent her weekends in archives and her evenings writing, a woman who was comfortable in libraries and in the field, who could read a 19th-century land deed and a Cajun folk ballad with equal fluency. "You look like you drove from Texas," she said. "I did drive from Texas, well, from Lafayette." "You look like you drove from Texas in a Hyundai with no air conditioning." "The air conditioning works. The humidity doesn't care about air conditioning." She laughed. She handed him a glass of iced tea from the pitcher she had brought. They sat on the gallery in the rocking chairs, and they looked at the street, the oak trees, the canopy of leaves that arched over the road like the vault of a cathedral, the dappled light that filtered through the Spanish moss and lay on the asphalt in shifting, luminous coins. "So," Tomas said, "Grandmere's estate, how bad is it?" "It's not bad, it's complicated. There's the house, the land, the contents. The attorney says it'll take 2 or 3 days to inventory everything, sign the papers, get the probate process started. We can stay in the house. Estelle left it furnished." 2 or 3 days, fine. I can work from here. I brought my laptop." Sarah looked at him. She had the expression that academics get when they are about to say something that they know will not be received well, the slight tightening of the jaw, the small, preparatory adjustment of the glasses. "There's something you should know," she said, "about the town. If this is about the ghost stories." "It's not about ghost stories, it's about the curfew." "What curfew?" 9 p.m. every night. The town locks down, the streetlights go off, the doors get bolted, not just the houses, the businesses, the church, everything. The town councilman walks the main street and personally shuts off every light. "That's," Tomas paused. He tried to find a word that was not insane or ridiculous or the most backward thing I've ever heard. He settled on unusual. "It's been like that for as long as anyone can remember. My father used to tell me about it when I was a kid. He said the old people, the really old people, the ones who remembered the turn of the century, were the most serious about it. They wouldn't just lock their doors. They'd put iron bars across them, heavy iron bars like you'd see on a medieval gate." "Iron bars. Iron bars. On their doors." "On their doors. And they'd put iron bars on their windows too. And they'd fill their fireplaces with iron grates, not for cooking but for, what's the word, warding, keeping things out." "Keeping what out?" Sarah sipped her tea. She looked at the oak trees. The light was beginning to slant, the afternoon tilting toward evening, the shadows lengthening beneath the canopy. It was 6:30 p.m. The sun would set in an hour. The streetlights would come on at sunset, and at 9:00 p.m. they would go off and the town would go dark and the doors would be bolted and the iron bars would be placed. "Molly," Sarah said. "They were keeping out Molly." Tomas listened to the stories that evening, as the light faded and the heat relented, and the fireflies began to rise from the grass like sparks from a dying fire. He listened with the polite, attentive skepticism of a man who has been trained, by education and profession, to treat the unexplained as the not yet explained rather than the unexplainable. He listened as Sarah told him about Molly, the woman, the betrayal, the death, the return, the embrace, the scream. He listened as she told him about the curfew, the iron bars, the way the town had organized its nightly ritual of lockdown with a precision and a seriousness that went far beyond habit and into the territory of collective survival. He listened, and he was not convinced. "It's a folk tradition," he said. "Every culture has them. The lockup, the curfew, the bars. It's a ritualized response to historical trauma. Something happened here, something bad enough that the community institutionalized a defensive behavior. And over time, the behavior became a tradition, and the tradition became a story, and the story became Molly. But the original event, the thing that scared them enough to start locking their doors at 9, was probably a crime. A serial killer, maybe, or a band of raiders, something real. Probably, Sarah said. She did not argue. She was a historian, and historians, like scientists, are trained to seek evidence before drawing conclusions. But she was also a Guidry, and the Guidrys had been in Abbeville since the founding, and the Guidrys had their own stories, stories that were not told to outsiders, stories that were kept in a locked cabinet in the family archive, stories that included, among other things, a journal entry from 1897 written by Sarah's great-great-grandfather, a man named Theodore Guidry, that read, "Molly came for Henry last night. We found him on the gallery, his chest crushed, his ears bleeding. He was alive when we found him. He died before the doctor arrived. His face was the worst. He looked like he had seen something he wanted more than anything in the world. He looked like he had seen God, and God had crushed him." Sarah had read the entry. She had read it many times. She had not told Tomas about it because Tomas was a skeptic, and skeptics do not process evidence that contradicts their worldview. They process the evidence's flaws, its inconsistencies, its failure to meet the standards of proof that their training has established as sufficient. She did not blame Tomas for this. She was in many ways the same. But she had read the entry, and she had read the coroner's reports, 3 of them from 3 different decades, all describing the same pattern of injury. Collapsed ribcage, burst eardrums, anomalous residue, and the expression. And she had begun, slowly and reluctantly, to consider the possibility that the stories were not stories. But she did not tell Tomas this. She told him to be inside by 9. "I'll be inside by 9, Tomas said. "I'm not an idiot. I don't need to believe in a ghost to respect a community's traditions." "Good," Sarah said. "Good," Tomas said. And at 9:00 p.m., when the streetlights went dark and the town went quiet, and the sound of heavy iron bars being slid into place echoed through the empty streets like the sound of a prison securing its cells for the night, Tomas was inside, sitting on the gallery behind Estelle's locked door, watching the darkness settle over the street like a blanket, and thinking about nothing in particular, and certainly not about Molly. He was not thinking about Molly when he went to bed at 10:30. He was not thinking about her when he lay in the dark, in his grandmother's guest room, on a mattress that smelled of lavender and old fabric, listening to the sound of the cicadas and the frogs and the distant, low rumble of a thunderstorm building over the gulf. He was not thinking about her when he closed his eyes and drifted toward sleep, his mind loosening, his body relaxing, the heat and the tea and the long drive conspiring to pull him down into the first deep, genuine sleep he had had in days. He was not thinking about her at midnight when he woke up, wide awake, restless, his skin prickling with the particular electric unease of a person who has slept in an unfamiliar place, and whose body has not yet learned the rhythms of the house, the creaks, the settling, the way the floorboards expand in the heat and contract in the cool. He lay in the dark for 10 minutes, 15, 20. The restlessness became agitation. The agitation became claustrophobia. The walls of the small guest room seemed to close in, the ceiling to lower, the air to thicken, and Tomas needed, physically, urgently, irrationally, to be outside, to move, to breathe air that was not the air of his grandmother's house, to walk. He got up. He put on his shoes. He opened the bedroom door. The house was dark and quiet. Sarah's door at the end of the hall was closed. The gallery door was locked. He had locked it himself. But the key was on the hook by the frame where Estelle had always kept it, and Tomas took it down and unlocked the door and stepped out onto the gallery and into the night. The air was warm and wet and thick. The street was dark. Not the darkness of a city, which is never truly dark, but the absolute, total, aboriginal darkness of a town that had turned off its lights and locked its doors and retreated behind its iron bars and was, at midnight, as close to the state of nature as a human settlement could get. The oak trees were invisible. The sky was a faint, milky smear of stars behind the canopy. The only light was the distant, orange glow of a security lamp at the hardware store 2 blocks away, a lamp that, Tomas would later learn, was the only light in Abbeville that the town councilman did not control, because it was on a timer that he had never been able to find. Tomas walked down the gallery steps. His feet hit the sidewalk. He turned left toward downtown, toward the hardware store and the orange light. He walked. The street was empty, not just quiet, empty. No cars, no people, no dogs, no cats, no movement. The houses he passed were dark and sealed, their shutters closed, their doors barred. He could see, through the gaps in a few shutters, the faint blue flicker of television screens, people inside, awake, watching, not sleeping. And he could hear, if he listened, the low murmur of conversation behind the walls, the sound of people who were not sleeping but who were also not outside, who were in their houses with their doors locked and their iron bars in place, and who were, in their refusal to be outside, in their insistence on being inside and locked and barred, telling a story of their own, a story that was not about Molly, that was not about the embrace, but that was about the darkness itself, and about what the darkness contained. Tomas walked. He passed the hardware store. He passed the pharmacy. He passed the post office and the Catholic church and the closed and shuttered diner. He walked to the edge of downtown, where the commercial buildings gave way to residential blocks, and the residential blocks gave way to a stretch of road that led out of town, a 2-lane blacktop lined with ancient oaks whose canopy met overhead and blocked the sky. He should have turned around. He knew this. He knew it the way a person knows that a stove is hot or that a cliff is high, not through experience but through the accumulated wisdom of every human who has ever lived and who has ever felt, in the presence of a certain kind of darkness, the pull of something that is not curiosity but compulsion. He should have turned around. He did not. He walked into the tunnel of oaks. The canopy closed over Tomas like a lid. The oaks were ancient, 200 years old, maybe more, their trunks as wide as cars, their branches arching across the 2-lane road and interlocking overhead in a lattice of wood and moss and Spanish beards so dense that the starlight, already faint, was extinguished entirely. The road became a tunnel. The darkness became total. The only light was the faint, gray luminescence of the asphalt itself, which held the memory of the day's heat and glowed, in the way that dark surfaces glow when the eyes have adjusted, with a barely perceptible infrared warmth that was less a light than an impression of one. Tomas walked. His footsteps were loud in the tunnel, the slap of his shoes on the asphalt, the crunch of acorns, the dry rattle of leaves skittering across the road in a breeze he could not feel. The sound was amplified by the canopy, which reflected and concentrated the noise the way the walls of a cave concentrate a whisper, and the effect was that his footsteps did not sound like footsteps but like the footsteps of someone walking behind him, slightly out of sync, slightly off rhythm, the way an echo is slightly behind the sound that produced it. He stopped. The footsteps stopped. He listened. Nothing. The silence of the tunnel was not the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a full place, a silence that contained something, the way a held breath contains a shout. He started walking again. The footsteps resumed, his footsteps, only his footsteps. And then beneath them, another sound. It was not footsteps. It was the sound of fabric, heavy fabric, thick fabric, the sound of a long garment dragging on the ground. It was a whisper of cloth on asphalt, a slow, continuous, rhythmic whisper that did not match his footsteps but had its own cadence, slower, steadier, the pace of something that was not walking but gliding, that was not stepping but drifting, that was not hurrying but moving with the patient, inexorable consistency of a tide. Tomas stopped. The sound of fabric continued. It did not stop. He turned around. The tunnel of oak stretched behind him, as dark as the tunnel ahead. The road was empty. There was nothing to see, no shape, no silhouette, no figure. The darkness was uniform, complete, impenetrable. And the sound of the fabric continued, the slow, rhythmic whisper of cloth on asphalt, growing neither louder nor softer, maintaining a distance that was, Tomas realized with a sudden, cold clarity, constant. He started walking. Faster. The sound of his own footsteps accelerated. The slap, slap, slap of a man who is no longer walking but is not yet running. The transitional gait of a person who is trying to increase the distance between himself and something he cannot see without acknowledging that he is trying to increase the distance between himself and something he cannot see. Because to acknowledge that would be to acknowledge that the thing was real, and Tomas was not ready to do that. The sound of the fabric maintained its pace. It did not accelerate. It did not decelerate. It was the same distance behind him, the same volume, the same rhythm, and Tomas, who had spent his career working with algorithms and data sets and the mathematical relationships between variables, understood what this meant before his conscious mind could articulate it. The thing behind him was not following him. It was pacing him. It was maintaining a fixed distance, a constant, the way a function maintains a constant value regardless of the input, and the constant was 50 feet. He walked faster. The fabric sound stayed at 50 feet. He walked faster still. His footsteps were a rapid, urgent staccato now, the sound of a man on the edge of running, and the fabric sound was the same, 50 feet, the same volume, the same rhythm, the same slow, steady, gliding whisper of heavy cloth on dark asphalt. He ran. He ran down the center of the two-lane road, his arms pumping, his breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps, his shoes slapping the asphalt with a sound like gunshots in the tunnel of oaks. He ran for 30 seconds, 40, 50, a minute. He was a man in his 30s, reasonably fit, and he ran at a pace that would have covered 300 yards in that minute, and when he looked back, when he turned his head in mid-stride and looked back down the road, he saw her. She was 50 feet behind him. She was not running. She was not walking. She was gliding, a vertical, black, 8-foot-tall pillar of fabric that moved down the center of the road with the slow, rhythmic, metronome consistency of something that did not need to chase because it knew, with the absolute certainty of a thing that had been doing this for nearly 2 centuries, that its prey would tire before it did. She wore a long black dress, heavy, thick, the fabric of a morning gown from another century, and a wide-brimmed black hat that hid her face, that cast a shadow over whatever was beneath it, that created at the top of the 8-foot pillar of black, a disk of darkness that was darker than the darkness around it. Her arms were hidden within the dress, within the folds of the fabric, and the dress dragged on the road behind her, and the whisper of the fabric on the asphalt was the sound that Tomas had been hearing for the last 3 minutes, and the sound was 50 feet behind him, and it was the same distance it had been when he was walking. Tomas stopped running. He stood in the road, his chest heaving, his legs burning, his breath tearing in and out of his lungs in ragged, painful gasps. He looked at the figure. The figure was 50 feet away. It had not gained an inch. His rational mind, his data scientist's mind, the mind that sought explanation, that found patterns, that reduced the inexplicable to the explicable through the systematic application of logic, seized on this. If the thing were a person in a costume, a person on stilts, a person doing an elaborate theatrical prank, then it should have fallen behind when he ran. A person on stilts cannot run at the speed of a running man. A person in a costume cannot maintain a constant distance while the target accelerates. Physics, biomechanics, the basic, non-negotiable constraints of a physical body moving through physical space. But the thing had not fallen behind. It had maintained its distance with the precision of a machine, the consistency of a law, the invariability of something that was not subject to the constraints that governed physical bodies. Tomas's rational mind offered, for the first time in his life, no explanation. He turned around, he ran. He ran hard. He ran the way a person runs when they are not running towards something but away from it, the way a person runs when the thing behind them is not a threat but a certainty, not a danger but an inevitability, and running is not a strategy but a prayer. He ran past the oaks, past the residential blocks, past the Catholic church, past the post office, past the pharmacy, past the hardware store with its lone, orange, timer-controlled security lamp that cast a pool of light onto the sidewalk and that Tomas, in his panic, saw as a lighthouse, a beacon, the last navigational aid of a sailor in a storm. The pillar of black was 50 feet behind him. He turned right, off the main road onto a side street, a narrow residential lane lined with small houses and picket fences and oak trees whose branches formed a secondary canopy. He ran down the center of the street. His footsteps echoed off the houses. A dog barked, once, twice, then silence, as though the dog had been silenced not by command but by something else, something that had passed through the dog's awareness and that had told the animal, in the language that animals speak and that humans have forgotten, to be quiet. The pillar of black was 50 feet behind him. He turned left, another street, another row of dark, sealed, barred houses. He ran. His legs were shaking now, not from exertion but from the adrenaline, the fight-or-flight response that was flooding his system with noradrenaline and glucose, and that was, in addition to making him faster and stronger and more alert, making him tremble, making his vision narrow, making his hearing acute and selective, filtering out everything except the sound of the fabric, the whisper of heavy cloth on asphalt, 50 feet behind him, always 50 feet, always the same. He turned right, left, right. He was in a maze, a grid of residential streets that he did not know, that he had never walked, that were identical in their arrangement of dark houses and oak trees and picket fences, and he was lost. Not geographically. He could find his way back to the main road by turning around, but strategically. He was running through a town that was locked and barred and dark, and there was no one to help him, no door to open, no light to run toward, no sound but the fabric and his footsteps and his breath. He turned a corner and hit a wall. It was a brick wall, the side of a building, a commercial building, the back of a structure that faced the main road and whose rear wall formed the end of the alley that Tomas, in his panicked, labyrinthine flight, had turned into. The wall was old brick, soft, red, the bricks laid in the running bond that was the standard for commercial construction in the early 20th century, the mortar crumbling in places, the surface rough and gritty with age. The alley was narrow, 6 feet wide, the walls of the buildings on either side rising 2 stories and blocking the sky. The alley was dead end. The brick wall was the end. Tomas pressed his back against the wall. He faced the alley. He could see the opening, the street, the darkness, the oak canopy beyond, and he could hear the fabric, the slow, rhythmic, gliding whisper growing neither louder nor softer, 50 feet from the mouth of the alley. 40 feet. 30. 20. The distance was changing. For the first time in the entire pursuit, the distance was changing. The thing was closing. The constant was breaking. And Tomas understood, in the part of his brain that was still capable of understanding, that the thing had not been unable to close the distance. It had chosen not to. It had maintained 50 feet because 50 feet was the distance at which the prey ran, and running prey was terrified prey, and terrified prey was. The pillar of black entered the alley. She was tall, 8 feet. The hat brushed the walls on either side, the wide brim scraping the brick, the sound of felt on rough clay adding a new texture to the whisper of the dress on the asphalt. The dress was long, longer than it needed to be, pooling on the ground behind her, dragging, whispering. The dress was black, not the black of fabric that has been dyed, but the black of fabric that absorbs light, that does not reflect, that does not participate in the visual economy of the world. That is not a surface but an absence. And the arms. The arms emerged from the dress as the thing entered the alley. They emerged slowly, the sleeves falling back from them, and the arms were long, longer than any human arm, longer than the proportion of any human body, reaching 6, 7 feet from the shoulders, and they were thin, and they were dark, and they were reaching. Reaching for Tomas. He pressed himself against the wall. The brick was rough against his back. He could feel every imperfection in the surface, the grit, the crumbling mortar, the edges of the bricks, through his shirt, as though his nervous system, in its final, desperate, adrenaline-saturated alertness, was cataloging every tactile input it could find, building a last, complete record of the physical world before the physical world was taken away. The arms reached him. The hands, she had hands, not claws, not paws, but long-fingered, thin, dark hands touched his shoulders. The touch was gentle. The touch was the touch of someone who is going to embrace you. The fingers curled around his shoulders, the thumbs hooking over his collarbones, the palms pressing flat against his back, and the grip tightened. The embrace began. It was not sudden. It was not violent. It was gradual, the way a boa constrictor kills, not with a single crushing bite, but with a slow, incremental, patient compression that allows the prey to exhale and then tightens further, preventing the next inhale, reducing the available space for the lungs by degrees, by millimeters, by the width of a breath. The arms drew Tomas forward, away from the wall into the alley, into the center of the dress, and the dress opened. It opened the way a curtain opens, the folds of fabric parting, and behind them was not a body but a darkness that was darker than the alley, darker than the night, darker than any darkness that Tomas had ever experienced, a darkness that was not the absence of light but the presence of something that consumed light, that drew it in, that swallowed it. The arms pulled him into the darkness of the dress. The fabric closed around him. He was inside, not inside a garment but inside a space, a void, a place that was not a place, and the space was cold, and the space was dark, and the space was silent, and in the silence he could hear nothing except the heartbeat of the thing that was holding him. The heartbeat was slow, 11 beats per minute. The rhythm was not human. It was the rhythm of something that had been waiting for a long time and that was in no hurry, something that had learned over centuries that patience was the most efficient weapon, and that the prey that was held long enough, squeezed slowly enough, terrorized thoroughly enough would not need to be killed. It would surrender. It would give up. It would, in the final analysis, embrace back. The pressure increased. The arms tightened. Tomas felt his ribcage compress. The first faint reduction of the intercostal spaces, the first slight bowing of the ribs inward, the first preliminary stage of a process that would end, if it continued, with the total collapse of his thoracic cage and the destruction of the organs it contained. The pressure was not painful, not yet. It was uncomfortable. It was the discomfort of a chest that cannot fully expand, of lungs that cannot fully inflate, of a body that is being held by something that does not understand, or does not care, that bodies need room to breathe. And then she screamed. The scream was not in his ear. The scream was in his skull. The scream entered his body not through his auditory canal, but through the bones of his skull, through the mandible and the temporal bone and the mastoid process, traveling through the bone conduction pathway that bypasses the ear canal and delivers sound directly to the cochlea. And the sound was not a sound but a vibration, a frequency, a physical force that oscillated at a magnitude and a duration that the human body was not designed to survive. The first thing to go was his balance. The vibration disrupted the fluid in his semicircular canals, and the world tilted, and Tomas felt himself falling, except that he was not falling because the arms were holding him, and the dissonance between the falling sensation and the reality of being held produced a nausea so intense that his stomach convulsed, and the vomit, thin, acid, the residue of the iced tea and the adrenaline, had nowhere to go because the dress was pressed against his face, and he choked. The second thing to go was his hearing. The eardrum stretched outward, not inward. the pressure of the scream building inside the sealed space of the dress, inside the sealed space of the embrace, until the tympanic membranes, designed to vibrate in response to sound waves of moderate intensity, were pushed past their elastic limit, and the right one burst. The pain was white and total, the pain of a body being damaged in a way that the body has no mechanism to process, no nerve pathway to interpret, no evolutionary precedent for responding to, and the burst was accompanied by a thin, warm trickle of fluid from his ear, the paralymph leaking from the ruptured membrane, running down his neck, warm and wet. Then the left eardrum burst, and the world went silent. Not quiet silent. The total, absolute vacuum silence of a person whose auditory system has been destroyed, whose connection to the world of sound has been severed, and who is now floating in a silence that is, paradoxically, louder than any noise, a silence that roars, that fills the head, that occupies every cubic inch of the skull. That is not the absence of sound but the presence of the end of sound. And in the silence the pressure continued, the arms tightened, the ribcage compressed. Tomas felt the ribs begin to move, the first subtle bowing of the bone, the first irreversible deformation of the cartilage, and he knew, in the silence, in the dark, in the embrace, that he was going to die, and that the death would not be quick, and that the thing that was killing him was not killing him out of malice or hunger or instinct, but out of something else, something that the stories called grief, and that the coroner called longing, and that Tomas, in his final, silent, compressed, bone-vibrated, suffocating moment, recognized as the thing it actually was. Loneliness. The thing was lonely. The thing had been lonely for 2 centuries. The thing had been betrayed and silenced and banished and forgotten, and the loneliness had curdled over decades and generations into something that was no longer grief but need, a need so vast and so consuming that it could only be expressed through the total, physical, bone-crushing embrace of another body, and the embrace was the killing, and the killing was the holding, and the holding was the only language the thing had left. Tomas felt the first rib snap. The pain was distant, muffled by the silence, by the shock, by the body's own analgesic response, the flood of endorphins that the dying brain releases in its final, futile act of mercy. The rib snapped inward, toward the lung, and the lung was punctured, and the air that had been in the lung escaped into the chest cavity, and the cavity began to fill, not with air but with blood, the blood from the lacerated lung tissue, warm and copper-smelling and filling the space where the lung had been, compressing the heart. And in the silence, in the dark, in the embrace, Tomas Browsard felt the thing press its face against his. He could not see it, he could not hear it, but he could feel it, the wide brim of the hat against his forehead, the darkness of the face against his face, the breath of the thing against his cheek, and the breath was cold and smelled of earth and of something older than earth, something that had been underground for a long time, something that had been buried. The last thing Tomas felt was the thing's face against his, and the face was not a face. It was a void, an emptiness, a nothing that pressed against his skin and that drew, through the contact, the warmth from his body and the air from his lungs, and the sight from his eyes and the sound from his ears and the self from his mind. And the self left, and the body remained, and the arms continued to hold the body long after the self was gone, because the thing did not let go. The thing held. The thing always held. Tomas Browsard was found at 5:47 a.m. by a mail carrier who was starting his route and who saw, at the mouth of the alley behind the hardware store, a pair of legs extending into the street. The mail carrier called the sheriff. The sheriff called Dr. Moffat. Dr. Moffat arrived at 6:30 a.m. and found the body exactly where it had been left, lying on its back in the alley, arms at its sides, eyes open, ribcage collapsed, eardrums burst outward, and an expression on the face that she recognized immediately because she had seen it 3 months earlier on the face of Jefferson Bro. Longing, frozen, total, irreversible longing. The face of a man who had seen something in his final moment that he had wanted more than anything in the world, and who had reached for it, and who had been crushed by the reaching. She examined the ears. The residue was there, the same reddish-brown, viscous, warm fluid she had found in Jefferson Broa's cochlea. She examined the chest. The compression was the same, concentric, circular, the pattern of a force applied by arms wrapped around the ribcage. She examined the clothing. The shirt was unbuttoned, not torn, not cut, unbuttoned, and on the skin of the chest over the sternum she found 2 marks, not punctures, not bruises. Impression, the faint, reddish, pressure point impressions of fingers, 5 on each side, pressed into the skin of the chest, the marks of hands that had gripped and squeezed, and the marks were warm, and the marks smelled of earth. She sealed the body. She called the sheriff. She said, "It's happening again." The sheriff said, "I know." And in the quiet, locked, barred town of Abbeville, behind doors that had been bolted at 9:00 p.m. and that had not been opened until dawn, the people heard, and they said nothing, because saying nothing was what they did. Saying nothing was what they had always done. Saying nothing was the curfew and the iron bars and the stories and the silence was the thing that kept them alive, and it was also, Sarah Guidry would later discover, the thing that had created the monster. Sarah found Tomas at 7:00 a.m. She had woken to find the guest room empty, the gallery door unlocked, the key on the hook. She had known before she left the house, before she walked the streets calling his name, before the sheriff found her and told her, she had known what had happened. She had known because she had spent a lifetime studying the way communities build their monsters, the way silence creates the things that silence is meant to prevent, the way the locked door and the iron bar and the turned-off streetlight are not defenses but confessions, admissions that the thing behind the door is real and that the door is not enough. She stood in the alley and looked at the chalk outline where Tomas's body had been, and she did not cry. She was not a person who cried. She was a person who researched, who investigated, who went to archives and read documents and built timelines and constructed narratives from the fragments that the past left behind, and she would do that now. She would do that for Tomas. She went to the estate attorney's office. She asked to see Estelle's personal papers. The attorney, a thin, elderly man named Mr. Landry who had been the Broussard family's lawyer for 40 years, looked at her with the expression of a man who has been expecting a conversation he does not want to have. "Your grandmother left something for you," he said. "Not in the will, separate. She gave it to me 10 years ago with instructions to give it to you, not Tomas, you, when you came for the estate." He opened a safe. He took out a box, old, wooden, the size of a shoebox, the wood dark with age and handling. He placed it on the desk. Sarah opened the box. Inside were documents, old documents handwritten in French and English dating back to the 1840s. Letters, journal entries, a deed, a court record, and a photograph, a daguerreotype faded, the image barely visible but showing when Sarah held it to the light, a tall, broad-shouldered woman in a long black dress and a wide-brimmed hat, standing on the gallery of a house that Sarah recognized as the Abbeville courthouse, and beneath the image, written in faded ink, Molly, 1847. And beneath the photograph, a letter, written in a hand that Sarah recognized, Estelle's hand, Estelle's precise, old-fashioned penmanship. The letter read, "My dear Sarah, I am giving you this because you are the one who will understand. You are the one who will read the documents and see the pattern and know what the town has done and what the town must do. The stories are true, all of them. Molly was real. She is still real. She has been real for as long as Abbeville has existed, and she will be real as long as Abbeville exists because Abbeville made her. The founding families, the Bros, the Guidrys, the Landrys, betrayed her. They took her land, her child, her name. They silenced her. They erased her from the records. And the silence they imposed did not kill her, it made her. The silence became her. The silence became the embrace. She is the silence, Sarah. She is the silence that the town created, and she walks the streets at night because the streets are silent. and the silence is hers, and anyone who breaks the silence, anyone who is out after dark, anyone who makes noise, anyone who refuses to be silent, is violating the silence, and she will embrace them. And the embrace is the silence closing around them, and the scream is the sound of the silence being broken, and the breaking kills. I am sorry, Sarah. I am sorry that I did not tell you this while I was alive. I was afraid. We are all afraid. We have been afraid for as long as the town has been silent, and the fear is part of the silence, and the silence is part of the fear, and I do not know how to break it. But you are a historian. You will read the documents. You will find the truth. And perhaps the truth will be louder than the silence. I love you, my dear. Be inside by 9. Sarah read the letter 3 times. She read the documents, the letters from the 1840s, the court records, the deed, the journal entries. She read them, and the pattern emerged, and the pattern was this. Molly had been real. Molly had been a woman, a tall, strong, dark-skinned woman, possibly of mixed Creole and African descent, who had owned a small parcel of land on the edge of the settlement and who had made her living as a seamstress. She had a child, a daughter born out of wedlock, fathered by a member of one of the founding families. The family, unwilling to acknowledge the child, had taken the daughter, placed her with a family in New Orleans, erased the record of her birth. Molly had protested. Molly had gone to the authorities, the parish court, the sheriff, the priest. She had been silenced. The court records showed that she had been charged with disturbing the peace being the silence that the founding families had imposed, and that she had been confined in 1847 to a cell in the parish jail, which was, at that time, a limestone cellar beneath the courthouse. She had died there. The records did not state the cause of death. The records stated only that the prisoner, Molly, was found deceased in her cell on the morning of October 3, 1847, and was buried in the parish cemetery without ceremony. Without ceremony, without marker, without name. The burial was the silence was the burial. And the silence, the erasure, the nullification, the total, comprehensive elimination of a woman named Molly from the record of human events, had produced, in the space between the living and the dead, in the space that the stories occupied and that the folklore described and that the coroner measured, and that the iron bars were designed to defend against, something that was not a ghost and was not a woman, and was not a memory, but that was, in the fullest and most terrible sense of the word, an embrace. The silence had become a body. The silence had become arms. The silence had become a dress and a hat and a pair of no, not red. The stories did not mention red eyes. The stories mentioned no face at all. The face beneath the hat was, in every account, every description, every whispered, porch-told story, a blank, a void, an emptiness that was not the absence of a face but the presence of the silence that had created it, the face of a woman who had been erased so thoroughly that even her ghost had no face. And the silence was hungry. The silence walked. The silence embraced. And the embrace, the total, crushing, bone-breaking, eardrum-bursting, organ-liquefying embrace, was the silence's way of saying the only thing it knew how to say, the only thing the silence had ever been. Be quiet, be still, be silent, be nothing. And the nothing would hold you, and the holding would be the last thing you ever felt. The college students arrived on Friday. There were 6 of them, 4 men and 2 women, all between the ages of 20 and 22, all students at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, all enrolled in a folklore and regional studies course that included, as its semester project, a field study of a local legend. They had chosen Huggin Molly. They had chosen Abbeville. They had loaded into 2 cars and driven 40 miles south on a Friday afternoon, armed with recording equipment, digital cameras, flashlights, and the unshakable, invincible confidence of young people who have read about something terrible and have decided, with the clarity that only the young possess, that the terrible is also the interesting, and that the interesting is also the fun. Their names were Kyle, Jake, Marcus, a different Marcus, A college Marcus, not the Marcus from the Stillwater retreat. The coincidence is noted only because the investigator who later compiled the reports of both events remarked on it in a footnote, as though the repetition of a name across two catastrophes was a detail that mattered, which it did not, but which the investigator, a man named Harmon who had a novelist's eye for the telling detail, could not bring himself to omit: Tiffany, Brianna, and Ashley. They arrived at 4:00 p.m., checked into the Abbeville Inn, a 6-room motor court on the highway that was the only lodging in town that was not a private residence, and began their field work. They interviewed locals. They recorded stories. They photographed the courthouse, the old jail, the cemetery. They walked the streets in the daylight, mapping the town, identifying the locations mentioned in the stories: the stretch of oak-canopied road where Molly was first sighted, the alley behind the hardware store where Tomas Broussard had been found, the courthouse gallery where the daguerreotype of Molly had been taken. They were told about the curfew. They were told by the innkeeper, a heavy-set woman named Mrs. Hebert, who leaned across the reception counter and said, in a voice that was low and urgent and that carried, beneath its Cajun-accented English, the tremor of genuine fear, 9 o'clock. You be inside. You lock the door. You don't come out until morning. Kyle, who was the group's leader, a tall, red-haired, athletic young man who spoke with the breezy authority of someone who had never been seriously afraid of anything, smiled. "Is that because of Huggin Molly?" he asked. Mrs. Hebert did not smile. "Because of what happens to people who are out after 9, she said. "Has anyone actually been hurt?" Tiffany asked. She was a psychology major, and she asked the question with the clinical detachment of someone who is collecting data, not the urgency of someone who is seeking reassurance. Mrs. Hebert looked at her. She looked at all of them, the 6 young people with their recording equipment and their cameras and their backpacks and their confidence, standing in the lobby of her motor court on a Friday afternoon, and she felt, in the looking, a weight in her chest that was not fear but sorrow. She had seen this before. Not often, not every year, not even every decade, but often enough. The outsiders who came, the curious who probed, the young who did not believe. She had seen them come, and she had seen what was left of them after. 2 people have died in the last 3 months, she said. Jefferson Bro, and a man named Tomas Broussard who was visiting from out of town. He was found in the alley behind the hardware store. His chest was crushed. His ears were bleeding. He was. She stopped. She did not want to describe the expression. She did not want to say the word longing to a group of 20-year-olds who would laugh at it, who would not understand that the expression was the worst part, that the expression was the thing that the coroner could not explain, and that the sheriff could not investigate, and that the priest could not pray away, because the expression was not the face of a victim, but the face of a volunteer, the face of a person who, in the final moment, had wanted the thing that was killing him. "Be inside by 9, she said. They were not inside by 9. They were inside by 8:47. They were in their rooms, 2 rooms, 3 per room, the doors locked, the curtains drawn. They were safe. They were compliant. They were doing what every resident of Abbeville did every night, and they were doing it because the innkeeper's face had told them something that the stories had not, that the fear was real, that the people who lived here believed, and that the belief was not the credulity of the uneducated but the hard-won, experiential, trauma-based knowledge of people who had seen what the silence could do. But at 9:30, Kyle looked out the window. He should not have. He knew this. He had been told. He had listened to Mrs. Hebert, and he had believed her, not fully, not with the bone-deep belief of a local, but enough to lock the door and draw the curtain and stay inside. But Kyle was 21 years old, and the night was quiet, and the curiosity that had brought him to Abbeville was not satisfied by sitting in a motel room with the lights on and the door locked. The curiosity was a hunger, and the hunger was specific. It was the hunger to see. He pulled back the curtain. He looked out. The parking lot of the motor court was empty. The highway beyond was dark. The streetlights had been turned off at 9:00 manually by the town councilman, and the only light was the faint, distant glow of a gas station 3 miles down the road, a smear of orange on the horizon that was less a light than a memory of light. The town was dark. The town was silent. The town was, in every way that mattered, invisible. And in the invisible town, on the highway, 50 feet from the parking lot, the pillar of black was standing. Kyle did not move. He did not breathe. He held the curtain with one hand and he looked through the gap between the fabric and the window frame, and he saw her. She was motionless. She was standing on the center line of the highway, facing the motor court, her 8-foot frame a vertical line of absolute black against the less black darkness of the night. The wide-brimmed hat was a disk of deeper dark. The dress was a column of deeper dark. She was not moving. She was not gliding. She was not whispering. She was simply there, present, patient, waiting, the way a spider waits at the center of a web, not hunting but available, not pursuing but present, confident in the knowledge that the web will do the work, that the prey will come, that the vibrations will reach her through the threads. Kyle let the curtain fall. He backed away from the window. His heart was pounding, not with the elevated, adrenaline-enhanced pounding of a person in immediate danger, but with the slow, heavy, deep-chest pounding of a person who has seen something that contradicts the fundamental architecture of his understanding of reality, and whose body, in advance of his mind, is beginning the process of recalibration. "Kyle," Jake said from the other bed, "what's wrong?" Kyle did not answer. He sat on his bed. He put his hands on his knees. He breathed. In, out, in, out. He was a data scientist in training. He believed in evidence. He had seen evidence. The evidence was standing on the highway. "We need to stay inside," he said. "No shit," Jake said. "What did you see?" "Nothing," Kyle said. "We need to stay inside." At 10:15, the music started. It came from the other room, the room where Tiffany, Brianna, and Ashley were staying. It was loud, very loud, loud enough to penetrate the wall between the rooms, loud enough to be heard across the parking lot, loud enough, Kyle realized with a cold, sinking, horrified clarity, to be heard on the highway. It was Marcus, not Kyle's Marcus, the other Marcus, the college Marcus, who was in the girls' room because the group had decided to hang out, and because Marcus had a Bluetooth speaker and a playlist of Louisiana blues that he wanted to play for atmosphere. The music was a track by a Cajun band, fiddle and accordion and a driving, rhythmic beat that was, in the context of a Friday night in a college town, a party song, a celebration song, a song that was meant to be played at volume, and that was, at this moment, at this volume in this town, the most dangerous sound in the world. Kyle ran to the connecting door. He knocked. He pounded. "Turn it off," he shouted. "Turn the music off." The music did not turn off. The music got louder. Kyle opened the connecting door. The girls' room was a party, 3 women and 2 men, Marcus and Jake, who had come over at some point. The Bluetooth speaker on the dresser, the lights on, the curtains open. Open, God, the curtains were open, and the music playing at a volume that vibrated the mirror on the wall. "What the hell are you doing?" Kyle shouted. "What does it look like?" Marcus said. He was sitting on the floor, his back against the bed, a beer in his hand. "We're having a good time. We're in Abbeville. We're studying the legend. We might as well live it." "Turn the music off. Close the curtains. The thing is out there. I saw it. It's on the highway. It's—" "The thing," Marcus said. He smiled. He had the kind of smile that was, in normal circumstances, charming, and that was, in these circumstances, the most infuriating thing Kyle had ever seen. "The Huggin Molly thing, the ghost, the legend. Kyle, we came here to study it. We came here to document it. We have cameras. We have recording equipment. If it's out there, we should be filming it. We should be hiding from it. Hiding from a story, hiding from a legend. Kyle, nothing is going to happen. Nothing ever happens in these towns. The legend is a story. The curfew is a tradition. The monster is a—" Marcus stopped. His beer glass was vibrating. Not shaking, vibrating. The liquid in the glass was trembling, the surface rippling with concentric waves that were not caused by any movement of Marcus's hand, any vibration of the floor, any seismic disturbance that had a physical source. The glass was vibrating because the air was vibrating, and the air was vibrating because something was producing a sound that was below the threshold of human hearing, but that was, for glass and liquid and other resonant objects, perceptible. The music stopped, not because someone turned it off. The Bluetooth speaker was still playing, the fiddle and accordion still driving their Cajun beat, but because the sound was swallowed, absorbed, consumed by a silence that was not silence, but that was the thing that the stories described, the thing that Estelle's letter had named, the silence that had become Molly. The silence entered the room. It did not come through the door was closed. It did not come through the window was closed. It came through the open curtains. It came through the gap between the glass and the frame, the imperceptible millimeter-wide space where the seal was imperfect, and it filled the room, and the music died and the lights flickered, not on and off but dimmer and brighter, the way the lights at the Stillwater retreat had flickered, the rhythm of something that was breathing. And then the fabric sound began. The slow, rhythmic gliding whisper of heavy cloth on asphalt, outside, below the window, getting closer. "Close the curtains," Kyle said. Nobody moved. They were frozen, not with the sleep paralysis of the night hag, not with the hypnagogic atonia of a brain caught between states, but with the simpler, more universal paralysis of people who have heard a sound that they do not understand and who are waiting, instinctively, for the sound to resolve into something that they can identify, categorize, and respond to. The sound resolved. The curtains moved, not from wind. There was no wind. The curtains moved from the outside, from the thing that was pressing against the window, and the glass was cold, condensation forming on the inside surface, the temperature differential between the warm room and the cold presence outside producing a film of moisture that ran down the glass in slow, meandering streams. Jake reached for the curtains. He pulled them closed. The thing was on the other side. Not behind the glass, against the glass, pressed against it. The glass was the only barrier, and the glass was single-paned, old, the original window of a motor court built in 1962, and the thing on the other side was not a person and was not a ghost and was not a legend. It was a body. A large, dark, 8-foot-tall body pressed against the window, and the arms were extending. The long, thin, spindly arms reaching up the sides of the window frame, the fingers spreading, the palms flat against the glass, and the glass was cracking. Not breaking, cracking. A web of fractures radiating from the center of the pane where the pressure was greatest, where the thing's face, body, chest, was pressing with a force that the old, single-pane glass could not withstand. The window shattered. The glass fell inward, hundreds of fragments, large and small, falling onto the floor and the bed, and the people in the room with a sound that was, in the silence, enormous, shattering, the loudest sound any of them had ever heard, and the silence broke, and the silence was broken by the thing that entered. She came through the window, not climbed, came. She flowed through the opening the way water flows through a breach in a dam, the dress and the hat and the arms and the body passing through the broken window frame in a single, continuous, liquid motion that did not respect the geometry of the opening, that did not conform to the dimensions of the frame, that occupied the space in a way that was not physical but that was, for all who witnessed it, undeniably present. She was in the room. She was 8 feet tall. She was black, total, absolute, light-consuming black, the dress and the hat and the face all the same shade of darkness, and the face beneath the hat, was what Sarah's grandmother's letter had said it would be, a void, an emptiness, a nothing that was not the absence of a face but the presence of the silence that had no face, the face of a woman who had been erased so completely that even her ghost had been denied a visage. The hat tilted. The face, The void turned toward Marcus, who was on the floor, his beer glass broken, the beer pooling on the carpet, and the arms reached for him. Marcus screamed. The scream was the last sound he made. The arms closed around him, the long, spindly, impossibly strong arms wrapping his body from shoulder to hip, the hands clasping behind his back, and the embrace began. And the embrace was the same embrace that had killed Tomas and Jefferson and the others. The slow, incremental, patient compression of a body being held by something that did not know, or did not care, or did not remember that bodies break. The others ran. Kyle ran for the door. Jake ran for the door. Tiffany ran for the door. Brianna ran for the connecting door, back to Kyle and Jake's room, through the connecting door toward the exit. Ashley did not run. Ashley was standing by the window, the broken window, through which the night air was streaming, cold and thick and smelling of earth and silence, and she was not moving. She was staring at Marcus, at the thing that was holding him, at the arms that were tightening, and her face was, not fear, something else. Something that Dr. Moffat would later recognize, and that she would note in her report with the same word she had used for Jefferson and Tomas: longing. Ashley was looking at Molly the way a child looks at a mother. Ashley was looking at the embrace the way a drowning person looks at a hand reaching down from above. "Ashley," Kyle screamed from the doorway. "Ashley, come on." Ashley did not come. Ashley stepped forward. She stepped toward the thing. She stepped toward the arms. And the thing, the 8-foot pillar of black, the silence that had become a body, turned. The hat tilted. The void that was the face turned from Marcus, who was being crushed, whose ribs were beginning to bow inward, whose breath was coming in shorter and shorter gasps, and the void turned to Ashley, and the arms. One set of arms, the right arm, released Marcus and reached for Ashley, and the long, spindly fingers touched her shoulder, and the touch was gentle, and the touch was the touch of something that had been lonely for 2 centuries, and that was, in this moment, in this room, in this shattered motel, being offered what it had been denied for its entire existence: a willing embrace. Ashley stepped into the arm. She leaned into the thing. She pressed her face against the darkness of the dress, and the darkness swallowed her. Not violently, not suddenly, but slowly, gently, the way a mother draws a child close, the fabric closing around her, the void absorbing her, and Ashley was gone, not taken, not dragged, not consumed, but gone, absorbed into the darkness, into the silence, into the body of the thing that had been made of silence, and that was now, with each body it held, each body it absorbed, each life it consumed, becoming more. Kyle grabbed Tiffany. He dragged her through the door. They ran. They ran across the parking lot, barefoot, the asphalt gritty and cold under their feet, and behind them the sound, the fabric sound, the scream that was not a scream but a vibration, the sound of Marcus's ribs breaking in the slow, sequential pattern that the coroner would later document, followed them. It did not chase. It did not need to. It was in the town was its, the silence was its, and they were in the silence. Jake was taken on Main Street. He had run east toward the courthouse, and the darkness of the oak canopy had swallowed him, and the fabric sound had found him, and the arms had found him, and the embrace had found him, and the scream had found him. And by the time the sheriff found his body the next morning, his ribcage was collapsed and his eardrums were burst, and his face wore the expression, the longing, the reaching, the frozen wanting, and the reddish-brown residue was in his ears. Brianna was taken in the alley behind the motor court. She had run in the wrong direction, not toward the highway, not toward the gas station, but deeper into the town, into the grid of dark streets and locked houses and barred doors, and the silence had found her, and the silence had held her, and the silence had crushed her, and the silence had left her in the alley with her arms at her sides and her eyes open, and her chest compressed to a width that the coroner would measure at 4 inches. Half the normal depth of a human thoracic cavity. Marcus, the college Marcus, was not found for 3 days. His body was in the motor courtroom in the corner where the thing had left him, and the room was cold, not the cold of a room in autumn, but the cold of a room that had been occupied by something that had no body heat, that had no metabolism, that had no source of warmth other than the warmth it stole from the bodies it held. Marcus's body was cold. His skin was gray, his ribs were collapsed, his ears were burst, and his face was the worst. His face was not the longing, his face was the silence. His face was blank, empty, voided. The face of a person whose self had been absorbed, whose consciousness had been consumed, whose personhood had been erased, as thoroughly and as completely as the woman named Molly had been erased in 1847. The thing had taken them all. 6 college students, 5 dead, 1 absorbed, and the town was silent, and the silence was the thing, and the thing was the silence. And Sarah Guidry was in her grandmother's house, behind a locked door, reading the documents, and she did not know, not yet, that the massacre had happened, or that the silence had grown, or that the thing that had been Molly was no longer a single pillar of black on a dark highway, but was, with each body it absorbed, each life it consumed, each silence it created, becoming something larger, something distributed, something that was not one silence but many, not one embrace but an architecture of embraces, a network of silence that was expanding through the town like frost through a window, covering every surface, filling every space, claiming every sound. The discovery came at dawn. Sarah walked to the motor court, 2 blocks from Estelle's house, and found the parking lot full of sheriff's cruisers and the rooms cordoned off with yellow tape, and the sheriff standing in the parking lot with his hat in his hands and his face the color of old ash. 6, he said, 6 of them and 2 more. He stopped. He looked at the sky. We found 2 more, local, in their houses. They were inside, they were locked, they were barred. He stopped again. He put his hat back on. She got them through the walls, not through the doors, through the walls, through the silence. They were in their beds, and the silence came through the walls, and he stopped a 3rd time. He did not finish the sentence. Sarah understood. The thing was no longer bound by the streets. The thing was no longer bound by the doors. The thing had grown, 6 bodies, 6 absorptions, 6 additions to the silence, and the silence was now large enough to pass through walls, to seep through the cracks in the mortar and the gaps in the siding and the spaces around the iron bars that had been, for a century and a half, the town's defense. The defense was failing. The iron bars kept out the physical, the arms, the dress, the body. They did not keep out the silence. The silence was not physical. The silence was the thing that the physical was made of, and it could go where bodies could not, and it could hold what arms could not reach, and it was, Sarah realized with a clarity that was worse than any terror, growing. "Where is she now?" Sarah asked. The sheriff looked at her. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been asked a question whose answer he does not want to give. "Everywhere," he said. "She's everywhere now. She's in the streets. She's in the walls. She's in the—" He stopped. He looked at the sky again. "She's in the sound. The silence is the sound now. The silence is the only sound. You walk down the street and you can hear her, not the fabric, not the scream, her. The silence. The silence of a woman who was erased, and the silence is in everything, and the silence is coming from everything, and if you listen." He stopped. He was shaking. Not trembling shaking, the way Marcus Tillman had shaken, the full-body vibration of a nervous system that has been overloaded and is discharging. The sheriff of Abbeville Parish was standing in a parking lot surrounded by the bodies of 6 college students and 2 of his own citizens, and he was shaking, and his voice was breaking, and his eyes were wet, and Sarah understood in that moment that the sheriff was not afraid of the thing. He was afraid of the silence. Everyone was afraid of the silence. The silence was the thing that had created the thing, and the thing was the silence, and the fear of the silence was the fear of the thing, and the fear was part of the silence, and the silence fed on the fear and the cycle. The silence creating the fear feeding the silence growing, the thing growing, was, Sarah understood, the mechanism. The mechanism was not supernatural. The mechanism was human. The mechanism was the thing that humans do when they are afraid. They go silent, and the silence grows, and the thing grows, and the fear grows, and the silence grows. The only way to break the cycle was to make a sound. But the sound was what attracted the thing. The sound was what the thing hunted. The more noise you made, the faster the thing found you. The silence was the defense and the silence was the trap, and the trap and the defense were the same thing, and Sarah understood with the historian's clarity why the town had never escaped. Because the town's defense was the town's prison, and the prison was the thing, and the thing was the silence, and the silence was the town. She needed to leave. She needed to get out of Abbeville, past the town line, beyond the reach of the silence, and she needed to do it before dark. She had approximately 11 hours. She needed a guide. Someone who knew the town, who knew the streets, who knew the geography of the silence, who knew which streets were quiet and which were not, which paths were safe and which were not, which ways out of town were blocked by the thing's presence and which were not. She found Marcus. Not the college Marcus, the other Marcus, the local Marcus, the Marcus who was not dead. Marcus Arsenault. He was a fisherman, a crabber, a man who had spent his life on the water and in the woods and who knew the land around Abbeville the way a musician knows an instrument. By feel, by instinct, by the accumulated, tactile, unconscious knowledge of a body that has moved through a place so many times that the place has become part of the body. He was 45 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet. The quiet of a man who is quiet not out of fear but out of preference. The quiet of a man who is comfortable with silence because he has never been afraid of it. He was afraid now. Sarah could see it in his eyes, the same look that the sheriff had, the look of a person who has realized that the thing they have lived with their entire life is not the thing they thought it was. The silence had always been there. The silence had always been Molly. Marcus had always known the stories, had always locked his door at 9, had always placed the iron bar and drawn the curtain and been inside by dark. He had done it the way you brush your teeth, automatically, without thinking, without examining the reason. And now the reason had been examined, and the reason was a thing in a black dress that crushed people's chests and burst their eardrums and absorbed their bodies into the silence. And Marcus Arsenault was afraid. "I need to get to the town line," Sarah said. "Before dark, I need you to guide me." Marcus looked at her. He looked at the sky. The sun was climbing 9:00 a.m. maybe, the morning light spreading across the rooftops and the oak canopy, the light that was, for the next 12 hours, their protection. The thing did not walk in daylight. The thing was the silence, and daylight was the opposite of silence. Not because daylight was loud, but because daylight was visible, and visibility was the enemy of silence, and the thing could not exist where it was seen. "I know the way," Marcus said. "Through the square, past the courthouse. Out on the old river road, it's the shortest." "Is it the safest?" Marcus looked at her. "Nothing is safe," he said. "Not anymore." They left at 3:00 p.m. They chose the afternoon because the afternoon was bright, the sun high, the shadows short, the light at its most direct, its most unforgiving, its most incompatible with the thing's existence. They would have 6 hours of light. The town line was 3 miles away through the town square past the courthouse down the old river road. 3 miles, 6 hours. They could make it. They walked. They walked in the daylight, and the daylight was safe, and the streets were empty. The townspeople in their houses, behind their bars, in their silence, waiting for the dark the way they waited every night, with the patient, resigned, habitual fear of people who had been doing this for so long that the fear had become a routine, and the routine had become a life. Sarah carried the documents, Estelle's box, the letters, the deed, the photograph, the journal entries. She carried them because they were the evidence, and the evidence was the sound, and the sound was the thing that would break the silence if anything could. She carried a flashlight, not for the walk which was in daylight but for the dark which was coming. Marcus carried nothing. He walked the way he walked, steady, sure, his feet finding the familiar path through the streets, his eyes scanning the shadows, his ears listening. He was listening for the fabric sound. He was listening for the silence. They reached the town square at 4:00 p.m. The square was a park, a block of green space in the center of town, bordered by the courthouse on one side, the church on another, the post office on a third, and a row of commercial buildings on the fourth. It was crossed by paths and dotted with benches and centered by a bandstand that had been built in 1912, and that was, in the daylight, a picturesque, quaint, small-town fixture that appeared on the cover of the Abbeville tourist brochure. In the failing light, it was the most exposed, most vulnerable, most dangerous space in the town. They had to cross it. The old river road was on the far side of the square, and the square was the only direct route, and the sun was behind the courthouse, and the courthouse was 2 stories, and its shadow was long, and the shadow was crossing the square like a sundial's hand, and the shadow was the silence's territory, and they had to cross it before the shadow covered the square completely. They walked. They walked fast, not running, because running was noise, and noise was the thing that the thing hunted, and they were in the thing's territory now, in the space where the silence lived, where the fabric sound was, and every sound they made, every footstep, every breath, every rustle of clothing, was a signal, a beacon, a vibration in the web that told the spider where the fly was. The square was quiet, not empty, quiet. The quiet of a space that is being listened to, the quiet of a room that is being watched, the quiet that is not the absence of sound but the presence of attention. Marcus held up his hand. Stop. Sarah stopped. They listened. Nothing. The silence. The absolute, total, filled silence of a place that is occupied by something that is not making a sound because it does not need to make a sound, because it is the sound, because the silence is the thing and the thing is the silence, and the silence is everywhere, and the silence is listening. Marcus pointed. Across the square on the far side at the entrance to the old river road, the shadow of the courthouse was moving. Not the shadow of the courthouse, the shadow of something else. Something that was in the shadow of the courthouse, that was using the shadow as a vehicle, that was moving in the darkness the way fish move in water, fluently, naturally, as though the darkness were not an absence but an element, not a void but a medium. It was the pillar of black, the 8-foot-tall, wide-hatted, long-dressed pillar of black, and it was at the entrance to the river road, and it was between them and the town line. Marcus pointed again, to the left. Another shadow, another movement, another pillar. No, the same pillar, the same thing, but in 2 places at once, or in 3, or in 4, because the thing had absorbed 6 bodies and 2 more, and the silence had grown, and the thing had divided, the way silence divides, the way darkness divides, the way the thing that was made of silence and darkness could be in every shadow, in every dark space, in every silence, because the silence was everywhere and the thing was the silence. The square was surrounded. Marcus's hand was shaking. Sarah's hand was steady. She was not calm, she was terrified, and the terror was the worst thing she had ever felt, worse than the grief of Tomas's death, worse than the horror of the documents, worse than anything. But the terror had, in the extremity of its intensity, produced a paradoxical stillness, a hyperclarity, a state of mind that was not calm but that was, in its focused, compressed, diamond-hard intensity, more functional than calm. She was thinking. She was thinking clearly, precisely, with the historian's mind that sought patterns and found them, that looked at the evidence and drew conclusions. The evidence, the thing hunted noise. The thing was the silence. The thing was in every shadow, in every dark space, in every silence. The thing was everywhere. The conclusion, the thing could not find what made no sound. The thing could not see what was silent. The thing was the silence, and the silence was the thing, and if Sarah became the silence, if she became so quiet, so still, so invisible that she was indistinguishable from the silence itself, the thing would not find her, because she would be the thing. She would be the silence. "I'm going to walk," she whispered, so quietly that Marcus, 2 feet away, had to lean in to hear. "I'm going to walk across the square. I'm going to be silent. I'm going to be still. I'm going to be the silence. And the silence is not going to find me because I am the silence." Marcus looked at her. His eyes were wide. His mouth was open. He was breathing hard. Heavy, audible breaths that were, Sarah realized, the loudest sound in the square, and the sound was drawing the thing, and the thing was moving, and the shadows were shifting, and the pillars of black were drifting toward them, toward the sound, toward Marcus's breath. "Be quiet," Sarah whispered. "Be still, be silent." Marcus tried. He closed his mouth. He breathed through his nose. He pressed his hands against his thighs to stop the shaking. He stood in the square in the daylight, in the failing daylight, and he tried to be silent. He could not. The fear was too big. The fear was louder than his will. The fear was in his breath and his heartbeat and the trembling of his hands and the vibration of his muscles, and the fear was noise, and the noise was drawing the thing, and the thing was coming, and Marcus saw it. He saw the pillar of black. It was 15 feet away. It was 10. It was 5. It was at the edge of the shadow, at the boundary between the light and the dark, and it was tall, and it was black, and the hat was wide, and the face beneath the hat was the void, and the arms were reaching, and the fingers were spreading. And Marcus saw all of this in the fraction of a second between the moment he saw the thing and the moment the thing saw him. And in that fraction of a second, his fear overwhelmed him. Marcus screamed. The scream was the loudest sound in the square. It was louder than the silence, louder than the fabric, louder than the heartbeat in Sarah's ears. It was the sound of a man who has seen the thing that has been hiding behind the silence his entire life. And the thing is worse than the silence, and the thing is worse than the stories, and the thing is worse than anything his imagination, which had been building the thing night after night, year after year, behind the locked door and the iron bar, had ever been able to construct. The thing was real. The thing was here. The thing was reaching for him. The arms closed around Marcus. He was standing, and the arms wrapped his chest, and the embrace began. The same embrace. The same slow, incremental, patient compression. And Marcus's scream was cut short, not by the compression but by the scream that the thing produced, the subsonic, bone-conducted, skull-penetrating vibration that was not a scream but the sound of the silence itself. The sound that the silence made when it found the noise it was looking for, and the sound liquefied Marcus's world, his balance, his hearing, his vision, his sense of self. And in the last moment, in the final, silent, compressed, crushed second of his life, Marcus Arsenault understood that the silence was not the monster. Silence was the grief. The silence was the loneliness. The silence was the 200-year-old grief of a woman who had been erased, and the embrace was not an attack but an attempt to hold, and the scream was not a weapon but a cry, and the thing that was killing him was not a monster but a woman who had been silenced so completely that the silence had become her body, and the body was looking for someone to hold, and the holding was the killing, and the killing was the only language she had left. Marcus's ribs cracked. The sound was wet and sequential. Sarah heard it. She was on the ground. She had dropped. She had done what she had said she would do. She had become the silence. She had dropped to the pavement and pressed herself flat and gone still and gone quiet and become indistinguishable from the ground, from the shadow, from the silence. And she heard Marcus's ribs crack, and she heard his breath stop, and she heard the fabric sound move away, and she did not move. She did not move for 20 minutes. She lay on the pavement of the town square in the shadow of the bandstand in the gathering dark, and she listened to the silence, and the silence listened to her, and neither of them moved. When the silence moved away, when the fabric sound drifted to the far side of the square, when the pillar of black moved into the shadow of the church and was still, Sarah opened her eyes. She looked at Marcus. He was on the ground, 10 feet away, his arms at his sides, his eyes open, his chest collapsed, his ears bleeding, his face wearing the expression, the longing, the reaching, the wanting. She did not look at his face again. She looked at the entrance to the old river road. It was clear. The pillar of black had moved away, drawn to the far side of the square by Marcus's scream, and the road was open, and the daylight was dying, and she had perhaps 30 minutes of light. She stood. She moved. She moved the way a person moves when they are being the silence, not walking but drifting, not stepping but flowing, her feet touching the ground without sound, her body moving through the air without displacement, her breath so shallow and so slow that it was not breathing but existing, and the existence was quiet, and the quiet was the silence, and the silence was her. She reached the old river road. She walked. She walked in the failing light, along the two-lane blacktop that led out of town, past the last houses and the last oak trees and the last streetlights that would not be turned on tonight because the person who turned them off had been found in his house that morning in his bed, his chest crushed, his ears burst, his face longing. The town line was a sign, a green highway sign, reflective, reading Abbeville, population 4,200 EST, 1843. The sign was at the edge of the town's jurisdiction, at the boundary of the silence, at the place where the thing's territory ended and the world of sound and light and noise and life began. Sarah walked toward the sign. She was 100 feet away, 50, 20. She felt the arms. They came from behind. They wrapped her chest, shoulders to waist, the long, spindly, impossibly strong fingers clasping in front of her sternum, the grip tightening, the embrace beginning. She felt the cold of the thing, the cold of the silence, the cold of 2 centuries of isolation. And she felt the dress against her back, and she felt the hat brush her hair, and she felt the face, the void, the nothing, the absence, press against the back of her head, and the silence was in her ear, and the silence was in her skull, and the silence was in her mind, and the silence was saying the only thing it knew how to say, the only thing the silence had ever said. Be quiet, be still, be silent, be nothing. Sarah was 10 feet from the sign. The arms tightened. The compression began, the first subtle bowing of the ribs, the first irreversible reduction of the intercostal spaces. She felt her lungs struggle. She felt her heart labor. She felt the scream building, the thing scream, the silence's scream, the sound that would burst her eardrums and liquefy her organs and stop her heart. She did not scream. She did not fight. She did not struggle. She stepped. 1 step, 2, 3. Each step harder than the last, the compression making it difficult to move, the arms making it difficult to breathe, the cold making it difficult to think. But she moved. She moved because she was the silence, and the silence was still, and the still was strong, and the strong walked. She crossed the line. The grip slipped. It did not release. The arms did not open, the fingers did not unclasp, but the grip slipped, the way a hand slips on a wet rope, the way a foot slips on a muddy bank. The thing's hold on Sarah weakened, not because the thing chose to let go, but because the thing could not hold her. The town line was the boundary. The town line was the edge of the silence. Beyond the town line, the silence was not the thing. Beyond the town line, the silence was just silence. The ordinary, natural, harmless silence of a night in the Louisiana countryside, the silence of crickets and frogs and the distant hum of the highway. The thing was Abbeville's silence. The thing was the silence of the town, the silence that the town had created, the silence that the founding families had imposed on a woman named Molly, and the silence could not exist outside the town, because the silence was the town, and the town was the silence, and outside the town there was noise, and the noise was life, and the thing could not live where there was life. The arms released. Sarah fell forward. She hit the ground, her knees, her hands, her chest against the dirt of the roadside, and she breathed, and the breathing was a sound, and the sound was life, and she was alive, and she was outside the town, and the thing was behind her, and the thing was at the line, and the thing could not cross. She looked back. The pillar of black was at the town line. It was standing at the sign, standing at the green, reflective highway sign that marked the boundary of Abbeville, population 4,200, established 1843, and it was still. It was not gliding. It was not whispering. It was not reaching. It was standing, the way it had stood on the highway outside the motor court, patient, present, waiting, the spider at the center of the web, confident that the web would do the work, confident that the prey would return, because the prey always returned, because the silence was in the prey now, and the prey would carry the silence wherever it went, and the silence would grow, and the thing would grow, and the silence would spread. The hat tilted. The face, the void, the nothing, the absence that was the presence of 2 centuries of erasure, turned toward Sarah. And for a split second, a fraction of a moment, the shadow beneath the hat lifted. The darkness that hid the face receded like a curtain drawn back, and Sarah saw. She did not see a monster. She did not see a ghost. She did not see the thing that the stories described, the 8-foot pillar, the long arms, the crushing embrace. She saw a face, a woman's face, a face that was not beautiful and not ugly and not old and not young, but that was empty, emptied. The face of a person who had been filled with a name, a voice, a child, a life, and who had been emptied by betrayal, by silence, by the systematic, deliberate, 2-century-long act of erasure that the town had performed on her. And the emptiness was not the absence of a face, but the presence of everything that had been taken away, and the everything was in the nothing. And the nothing was the face, and the face was the silence, and the silence was the town. The shadow fell, the hat was level, the face was gone. The pillar of black stood at the town line, motionless, and Sarah turned and she walked and she did not look back again. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.